Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our third and final virtual hearing of the 2020 Platform Drafting Committee. I am Keisha Lance Bottoms, and I have the honor of serving as the 60th mayor of Atlanta, Georgia, the cradle of the civil rights movement and the home to Congressman John Lewis. Thank you to everyone who's online watching the live stream and to the drafting committee members who are with us today. We had productive hearings on Monday and Wednesday, and I look forward to hearing more from those who are joining us today. Before we go any further, please join me in saying the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America
and to the republic
for which it stands,
one
nation,
under God,
indivisible,
with
liberty and justice
for all.
Before we get into our agenda today, I'd like to introduce the drafting committee members. This is a remarkable group of people who are leaders in the forefront of their fields. Dr. Tony Allen is the president of Delaware State University and still a part of the MEAC. Stuart Applebaum is the president of the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union. Congresswoman Catherine Clark represents the 5th Congressional District in Massachusetts. Senator Tammy Duckworth serves as the junior senator from the state of Illinois. Congresswoman Sylvia Garcia represents the 29th Congressional District in Texas. Dr. Heather Gottney is an associate professor at Fordham University. Don Graves is the former Domestic and Economic Policy Director in the office of Vice President Biden. Congresswoman Deb Haaland represents the 1st Congressional District in New Mexico. Ana Lilia Mejia serves as the political director on the Bernie 2020 campaign. Please tell me I got it right today. I've been practicing that all day long.
It was perfect.
Yay. Maybe I shouldn't try it again. Josh Orton serves as a senior advisor to Senator Sanders. State Senator Jose Javier Rodriguez is a member of the Florida Senate representing the 37th District. Julianne Smith was the former Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden under the Obama administration. Richard Trumka is the president of the AFL-CIO. Tom Vilsack is the former Secretary of Agriculture under President Obama. In addition, we are joined by Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who will serve as an ex officio member and was a member of the 2016 and 2012 drafting committee. Carmel Martin serves as senior advisor for policy on the Biden for President campaign and is the campaign's non-voting representative on our committee. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce you to the team who will be working with us throughout this process. Andrew Grossman is the platform director. He also served as platform director in 2012 and 2016. Leah Moody is the deputy director and has over 2 decades of experience working with allied groups and elected officials. Patrice Taylor is the director of party affairs at the DNC and is responsible for all of the party business that happens at the convention. Christina Costa and Martin Shorev are the writers and will be working with each of you as they put together the proposed draft that we will review. Zeppa Krieger is from the Biden campaign and serves as a liaison between the campaign, convention, and party. Quinn Tran and Tabitha Shustop round out the platform team. Quinn was also a part of the platform team in 2016 and 2012. This evening, we are holding our final platform drafting hearing. While this virtual format is not how we normally would conduct these hearings, we are pleased to report that there have been thousands who have logged onto YouTube to also hear these stories. Last night alone, there were over 9,000 views. Today's hearing is focused on restoring the soul of America. Joe Biden's vision for our country is one that respects our differences and enacting policy that reflect our shared values. The current administration has the opposite approach and will do everything they can to divide us. This is not who we are as Democrats, and I think it's important that we end this phase of our work discussing topics that speak to our core values. Over these past 3 nights, we've heard from over 5 dozen people who have shared their stories and insights on how we can best solve the problems so many of our fellow Americans are facing. Through the insights and ideas shared in these hearings and online, we can make sure that our platform will reflect the vision that our party has, which is to aspire to be a more perfect union. We have some great speakers today, so let's get started. Starting us off today is Christian Cooper. Mr. Cooper is a biomedical editor, comic book writer, and bird enthusiast. He has been in the news recently as a result of a confrontation he recorded in New York's Central Park. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Mayor Bottoms. Good afternoon, members of the Platform Drafting Committee, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm here because of a racist incident that happened in New York City Central Park while I was bird watching, an incident caught on video in which a white woman made a false accusation that, quote, an African-American man is threatening my life in an attempt to bring an especially urgent police response against me. That incident surprised a lot of people. Some were surprised by the brazenness of the use of race to manipulate the police. Others were surprised that this could happen in a liberal city like New York, or that a well-educated woman who considers herself a liberal could so easily resort to such a deplorable tactic. All of that shows how deeply racial bias runs in our society, racial bias that goes back centuries, and racial bias that now finds its biggest expression in the White House behind the desk in the Oval Office. There for 3.5 long years, we've had a president who takes every opportunity to divide Americans. He takes the ugliest impulses and gives them his support. He watches a march of neo-Nazis and declares that there are good people on both sides. And he sees a video of white nationalists screaming white power at peaceful protesters, and he retweets that with the presidential seal of approval. I'm here today because I'm done with that. I'm here today because even though what happened to me turned out to be a minor incident, the racial bias it demonstrated is the same racial bias that later that same day caused a white cop in Minneapolis to casually plant his knee on a black man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds until that black man was dead. I'm here today because unlike George Floyd and so many others before him, I'm lucky enough to still be here to talk about it. And as long as I am here, I will use my voice to push for something better. Beating back racial bias will be hard work and it will take real leadership. And there is no man better suited to this task, to this moment, than Joe Biden, for a very specific reason. He has known tragedy and loss in his own personal life, and he has been able to transform it and move forward from it to something better. And if that isn't exactly what this country needs, in the wake of the deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor and Tamir Rice, Patrick Dorismond and Amadou Diallo, Trayvon Martin and Eric Garner and all the others, I don't know what is. I urge the committee to stay true to principles we Democrats have long held dear by adopting a platform that deplores racial bias in general and in policing and the criminal justice system in particular. I urge the committee to advocate for specific measures to make the elimination of racial bias a reality. And I urge the committee to say, we are here, united as Americans of every color, creed, ethnicity, gender and gender identity, sexual orientation, age, ethnicity, and disability status. We stand together to say we are done with that incompetent, dangerous ugliness in the White House, and we stand together with Joe Biden. Thanks.
What a great way to begin our evening. Thank you so much, Mr. Cooper. We will now hear from Dr. Allen with his first question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening, Mr. Cooper. Thank you for your testimony. I just want to say two things at the start. There's nothing minor about the infraction that happened to you. As a person who has 1,700 young men under his care every year, we're done too. So thank you for being here. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how these infractions that happen to us more often than many folks know, the kinds of effects they have besides the physical abuse that often happens as a result, the psychosocial, emotional types of things that can continue and impact people over the long course of their lives. So could you just talk a little bit about that beyond those awful killings that have happened for so long to African-American communities? Talk a little bit about the psychosocial part of it as well and what that means for us too.
Well, I mean, I think many of us Black folk take it for granted because, you know, we experience it so often and so much that we just sort of develop a thick skin for it. You know, it kind of rolls off us, which is why I think it was such a surprise to so many white people to see it so brazenly in the video that I took. They perhaps don't know what we experience, and it is debilitating to experience that on a regular basis, to be followed through the grocery store, to not have the taxi cab stop when you try to hail one. Yeah, and then especially for the youth in certain neighborhoods, they're getting stopped with stop and frisk. Certainly here in New York City, they were getting stopped with stop and frisk all the time. And that's really, you know, that erodes the trust and the relationship between the community and the people, the officers who are supposed to be serving them. So it takes its toll.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from Senator Duckworth.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. I really appreciate your willingness to be here today. I think, again, that you de-emphasized your experience. I think Americans were shocked, whether it is in your incidents or, of course, with the death of George Floyd. It was, thank goodness, to the videos that were taken that really did make a difference. I think that it's more than systemic racism that happens in our country. I think that so much of it is not just bias, but I think it is actual racism that exists everywhere in our society. And I do think that your voice has been a very critical one. And could you speak a little bit to how you perceive the effect of stories such as yours is having? You mentioned that people were quite shocked, but I mean, frankly, I see, you know, in Mr. Trump, this systemic racism, but he's being enabled. He's been being enabled by those around him. I mean, recently, Vice President Pence was asked recently, does systemic racism exist? And he had no answer. It took him 400 words and he couldn't come out with the answer that yes, systemic racism exists and it can actually result in the death of Black Americans. You know, as an Asian American, I've been told to go home to my own country, even though my family has been here since the revolution. But I've never had to fear for my life the way that you have and so many Black Americans have. So could you speak a little bit to how the enabling that happens within the community if we don't speak up, if we don't call this out, if we don't fix this? And that's why it's so important for the DNC, for our platform committee to really make this a key point in our discussion as we go towards this election, that no longer are we going to turn a blind eye to this. And maybe you can talk a little bit about the stories that can come out, that can talk to, you know, young boys who are 9 years old hiding from police cars when they should be the ones looking to the police for help, but they know that that is a danger of them actually being hurt. It is because of the systemic racism that happens in our system. So speak a little bit to how your story you think is making a difference, but then also in terms of those who are enabling Mr. Trump. Thank you.
Okay, so.
I know it's a long question.
I hope my story is, and it seems to have started some conversations. Again, I think a lot of white people were either unaware or were turning a blind eye. And I think there are some distinctions that have to be made. There's the sort of lazy racism, the unconscious bias, the looking away because you don't want to know, crime is going down and the hammer isn't coming down on my community unjustly, so why do I have to worry about it as long as crime is going down? So there's that. Then there's the outright racism, which, I'm sorry, is behind the desk in the Oval Office. Just plain old, unadulterated racism. It's not even unconscious, and it's naked, and it's riling people up deliberately. And then you have what you spoke about, the enablers, those who are complicit. They don't necessarily share those views, but they are willing to sit by idly while those views run rampant because it serves some other agenda of theirs. And there are far too many people like that in the government right now who have whatever priority they think they can get passed through right now, as long as they take all the racist stuff that comes with it. And that's particularly corrosive to our democracy, because if we can't come together as a people, if we can, as Americans, unite to face the real challenges we have, like COVID, like global warming, climate change, we are going to be sunk as a nation. So it's not just something that affects Black people. It's something that is equally corrosive to white communities, but they're oblivious to it. And it is something that is going to sabotage all of our efforts to try to move our country forward to a better place. So that's why I think the committee really has to address this in the platform. It's not just a matter of doing right by Black people, though that should be enough, or doing, but it's a matter of making sure that our country can unite on issues that are of concern to all of us, of common concern, and move forward on them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. And I just tell you, I'm so appreciative that you represent so much of who we are. We are so many things. We are biomedical editors and comic book writers and bird enthusiasts, and sometimes all in one. And I think who you are really is an example of who we are as a people. And I appreciate your testimony and appreciate your being here today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Next, I have the honor of recognizing Reverend Dr. William Barber. Reverend Barber is an internationally known activist and lecturer and is co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and to the members of your committee. We will be submitting our full platform to the drafting by email. I greet you today on behalf of our co-chair, Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, and the entire Poor People's Campaign National Call for a Moral Revival family. I also greet you on behalf of the 140 million poor and low-income Americans in this country, 61% of African Americans, and 66 million white Americans. In this moment, it is so important that our demands not be so small. They have to be large, because many of us believe we are in the middle of a third reconstruction. The scriptures say in Isaiah 10, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children their prey. And so to address systemic racism and the right to democracy and equal protection, we must protect and expand the right to vote by reinstating key protections of the Voting Rights Act and developing a pre-clearance formula that includes jurisdictions that were covered by the VRA and jurisdictions that have passed voter suppression laws since 2013. Specifically, we know that Voting Rights Act has been blocked for 7 years as of last week, and this is unconscionable. We need to appoint judges that believe in voting rights and equal protection under the law. We must demilitarize the police and end the 1033 program and hold police and law enforcement accountable under state and federal law for abuses of their powers to kill. We must redirect certain funds from policing and mass incarceration toward community needs. We must establish an emergency National Truth Commission on mass incarceration and the police violence in the first 100 days to change policies. And we must have real immigration reform, because racism is not just toward African Americans, but our Latino brothers and sisters. Real immigration reform that moves immigration out of the Department of Homeland Security and redirects funds toward reuniting families, securing documentation, and meaningful existence to border families. We also must make sure that we protect and honor the rights of First Nation and Indigenous Native people, protect the rights of Indigenous people to their lands, their resources, the free exercise of their culture, because they were the first to experience the genocide and the racism here in this country. We must also increase federal funding for education and deal with resegregation, underfunding of public schools. We must push for a federal constitutional right to a public education, relieve student debt, especially for poor families, and provide free college for all. But also, we must change the definition and the measurement of poverty for today's cost of living. We must repeal TANF and establish guaranteed entitlement to the poor or to direct cash assistance programs. We must expand programs that work like SNAP and ETIC and CTC. And we must secure housing for all by establishing housing as a legal right. But we also must update the unemployment measure and expand employment coverage. We must repeal the Trump tax cuts. We must establish a universal and guaranteed adequate income and living wages of minimum of $15 an hour to immediately lift 39 to 40 million people out of poverty. We must establish a federal jobs program, the Jubilee Justice Jobs Program, to secure full employment as a right, jobs in healthcare, green jobs, infrastructure, education, and more. We must secure the right to form and join unions. We must expand Medicaid, protect Medicare, and establish a single-payer universal healthcare system for all. We must end medical debt, secure access to water and utilities for all, declare climate change a national emergency, establish a green jobs corps that protects poor communities and builds them back up. We must address not only the disease, but the economic devastation of COVID-19 and how it's impacting Black, brown, women, and poor communities. And we must cut military spending by $350 billion, demilitarize our communities, end the easy access to firearms, implement fair taxes and penalties on the wealthy, relieve medical debt, housing debt, water, titles debt, student debt, municipal debt, if they cannot be paid, and work to close the racial wealth divide with a baby bonds program. Why must we do all of these things and not one of them? Because there are 5 interlocking injustices that are threatening the soul of democracy. Systemic racism, from voter suppression to resegregation of public schools to mass incarceration, police violence, injustice toward our immigrant communities and our First Nation, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, 4 million families getting up every morning can buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water. The war economy that puts 54 cents of every discretionary dollar into war, and only 16 cents of every discretionary dollar into education, healthcare, and infrastructure. And we must address the false moral narrative of religious nationalism that basically says all you have to do is be against gay people, be for prayer in the school, be for tax cuts, be for guns, and be for an extremists who call themselves Republicans. And then you are on God's side. The fact of the matter is all 5 of these things are interlocking injustices. They've been with us, they are with us, and we must challenge them together if we are serious about fixing the soul of this democracy. We can do it, but we must do it together.
Thank you so much, Reverend Barbara. Next, we have, with a question, Congresswoman Lee.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bishop Barbara. So glad to see you. First, thank you so much for your tremendous leadership in leading this country, calling for a moral revival, because that is so central to regaining the soul of America. Let me ask you a question about the Poor People's Campaign, because I know you well, and I want to make sure we have on record the fact that you and the Poor People's Campaign talk about poverty and racism together. And could you explain why you promote policies beyond police violence when you talk about racism? And what do you think in our platform we need to address as it relates to racism and poverty? And we know that one of the biggest challenges facing African Americans, people of color, low-income people, poor people, is the lack of an equitable economic system. But we also know there's systemic racism throughout our system of government, private sector throughout the country. So thank you again very much for being here.
Thank you. Well, even Democrats must confess and repent some. You can't blame it all on Republicans, because too often we have been too hooked to a neoliberalism attitude. We take care of the middle class and up, we fix the society. The fact of the matter is we don't hear enough about poverty and low income folk, even from either party. And that is the challenge, because you can't separate racism and poverty. And you have to talk about how systemic racism, for instance, take the issue of voter suppression. Voter suppression allows people to get elected, and once they get elected, they pass bills against the poor that hurts mostly white people in raw numbers. It hurts mostly Black people in terms of percentage, but white people in raw numbers. So when they block living wages, 54% of African Americans are without living wages, but of the 62 million Americans that are without living wages, the majority of them are white. So we have to talk about all 5 of these issues together. Systemic racism cannot be a spectacle issue just about police violence. It is, but it is also about what happens in education and incarceration and in immigration reform and in police violence. What happens in the courts? What happens against our indigenous people? Systemic racism is not just against Black people, it's targeted at Black people and people of color, but it's literally against the democracy. And that is why in the Poor People's Campaign, we have Black and white and brown and red and yellow and gay and straight and people from Appalachian Mountains all the way down to the Delta of Mississippi who are joining together, Kansas farmers and fast food workers from the Carolinas who are saying there are 5 interlocking injustices that impact 43% of this country. 43% of this country is poor and low wealth. And we must hear that. You cannot walk away from that. And we cannot separate that from talking about racism in all of its depths. There needs to be a cleansing, if you will, in this country. We make a mistake. Congressman Lee, lastly, if we just get caught up in symbolism and statues and flags being removed, and even if we pass one bill on police violence, which I'm glad will happen and has happened in the House, that does not fully address the issue of systemic racism and poverty. And any party, whatever that party's name is, that's going to be serious about the soul of this America, of this country, has to get down in the soul. Lastly, you've heard rising tides raise all boats. No, they don't. No, they don't, because it depends on what kind of boat you have. And if racism and policy racism puts holes in the boat, poverty puts holes in the boats, ecological devastation puts holes in the boat, putting more money in water than we do in infrastructure and education, healthcare puts holes in the boat, and they are all interlocking injustices that we have to address if we're going to deal with the soul of the nation.
Thank you so much. I'm sure our platform will listen. Those of us on the committee heard you loud and clear, and we'll try to make sure we address many of the issues that you have raised, which are so important to regaining the soul of America, Bishop Barber. Thank you again. Thank you, Madam Chair and Mayor Bottoms.
Thank you, Bishop Barber. I feel like we should have given you a night all by yourself. Thank you. Our next question is Congresswoman Holland, from Congresswoman Holland.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Reverend Bishop Barber. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your support of the work we're trying to do in Congress to bring underrepresented voices to the table. Thank you for including Indigenous people in your platform. And thank you for coming to our hearing on sacred sites. I truly appreciate having you there for all of us. Throughout your work, you've highlighted that the key to real change is in connecting people of all backgrounds around pressing issues and common goals. Since the killing of George Floyd, God rest his soul, we've seen the largest multiracial civil rights demonstrations in American history. This moment seems different, and I remain hopeful. What real steps can we take to make sure this momentum turns into real action for the goals that we so badly need to accomplish?
Well, in some ways, I would, first of all, we have to deal with Indigenous people, because you all are the first chapter. And I've learned that in being among the Apaches and the Navajo, and we cannot forget that. If we do that, then we actually undermine the democracy. We don't deal with where the genocide began before people were brought from Africa, the genocide that happened here, and how that impacts what happened from Africa. It's not about whose pain is the greatest, but how we deal with the ugliness, the sinisterness of racism and injustice as one. Secondly, we are seeing the largest demonstration. But I would say one thing in history, we got to be clear, this is not the first time, and it may not, and per capita, because the abolition movement was united with people. There was the uniting of the civil rights movement, the peace movement, the Poor People's Campaign that was assassinated. What we know from American history, there has always been these moral multiracial coalitions that come together in a time of transformation. Now, what must we do? We must not take all that's happening in the street and think all that is going on is just a transformation of the policing in this country. When George Floyd said, "I can't breathe," it was shorthand, I believe, for a lot of folk who are saying, "I can't breathe," with 700 people dying a day from poverty and low wealth in this country. I can't breathe when I'm being sent into lethal work because the government is not protecting me with PPEs and giving me essential things that I need, giving me a name change essential worker without the essentials of sick care, sick leave, and unemployment. I can't breathe because of all the other killings that have taken place. I can't breathe for all the people that are dying, 70, 80% that didn't have to die. It is shorthand that there is a kind of suffocation going on. And what we have to do is recognize that the marching in the street is justice trying to breathe, equal protection under the law trying to breathe. So I believe what we must do, and in the Poor People's Campaign, we say, if we are serious about the soul of this nation, the first call of this nation is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So we need to do a DM on every public policy on the DL, a death measurement on every piece of public policy on the down low. What do I mean by that? We need to look at every piece of public policy. Does denial of health care kill people? Yes. Well, then it shouldn't be a part of our society. Does denying living wages cause people to die? Yes. Then it shouldn't be a part of it. We should change it. Does voting rights cause people to die? Yes, because when you deny voting rights, you then allow people to get elected. Once they get elected, they pass policies that block healthcare, block living wages, and when those things are blocked, people die. We must say, America, death is no longer acceptable anymore. We cannot allow the continuous, what Dr. King called the strangulation and the murder of policy, and what Coretta Scott King called the violence of public policy. We cannot continue to allow this violence. There's too much public policy violence, and we need to take our greatest moral constitutional values, equal protection under the law, establishment of justice, providing for the common defend, promoting the general welfare, and our deepest religious values, love, truth, and mercy, put those on top of every piece of legislation. And if that piece of legislation doesn't live up to those ideals, then it has no place in this democracy. It is counter, it is an antithesis to everything we believe. And so every piece of public policy that has death in it, if we are going to honor George Floyd, if we are moved by his death, we got to be moved by the thousands of people that died without being on the camera from not having health care. We have to be moved by the hundreds of people that die from poverty and low wealth. We have to be moved by the thousands of people that die from ecological devastation. We have to be moved by the people that die from the war economy and the misappropriation of funds into things that produce death and not life. And then we go after that and produce public policy that brings life. And if we do that, we will save the soul of this democracy.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. And our final question is from Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Reverend Barber, for all that you've done for the country to continue to raise awareness, to continue to advocate for so many people who've been left out, Americans of all colors, ethnicities, heritages, and backgrounds. If we're to truly restore the soul of our nation, we have to deal everyone back into the economic bargain that systemic issues are continuing to prevent people from participating in. I think about, we're just a few weeks past Juneteenth, more than 150 years ago, my great-great-grandmother was freed just months ahead of the Emancipation Proclamation. And I think often about the fact that despite all of that, we still persevere, but there are those among us who have continued to divide our house, suggesting that the differences among us are wrongness as opposed to a strength for our society. So I guess my question for you is, how do we continue to show that when one of us is held down, we're all held down? When some of us don't have opportunities, it means we all can't live to our potential. When a few of us can't breathe, it means none of us can breathe. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Certainly, and thank you so much. The full push of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival, is that fusion, moral fusion is the only thing that works. That's how we have, as I said, a Kansas farming family connected now with fast food workers from the Carolinas, black and white, or Latinos from California, or Apaches from Arizona. Because in this agenda of dealing with these 5 interlocking injustices of systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, people find their own connectedness. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. A very recent example is in Kentucky. We started organizing in Kentucky. And up in the hills of Kentucky, Harlan County, where Democrats, by the way, need to go back to. That's where Lyndon Baines Johnson launched the war on poverty, and we haven't really been there like we should have, and people are upset about that. They don't like that they're being not talked about. But many of them didn't vote for Republicans. They didn't vote for extremists. Many of them just didn't vote. The margin of poor and low wealth people that did not vote far outweighs any victory in any political campaign. 2 million didn't vote in the 3 states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, that the current occupant of the White House won. But here's what we did. We went in those mountains and we put up a map that showed racist voter suppression and how racist voter suppression allows who to get elected in Kentucky, particularly in the state house. Then we showed where those persons stood on living wages and union rights and getting coal miners their health care and protecting the water and protecting people up in those hills. And one guy stood back and said, well, wait a minute, we're being played against each other. And we said, and that's the point. The point is, this country is really ready for a grown-up conversation about how these interlocking injustices are hurting us. We have to be careful in political arenas not to isolate them, not to just have these rises when we're concerned about one issue and then we move on. I wish, as a matter of fact, that if somebody was running for president, that they would say, here's my healthcare program. And this is how it's going to help Black people. This is how it's going to help brown people. This is how it's going to help indigenous people. This is how it's going to lift Asian people. This is how it's going to lift people in the mountains. This is how it's going to lift people in the Delta. Here's my economic banking plan. This is how it's going to lift Black people. This is how it's going to lift white people. This is how it's going to lift people in the mountains. This is how it's going to lift people on the West Coast. In other words, why can't we just disaggregate our policies and show how the policies will lift everybody, rather than having something over here, something over there? In other words, address racism and do it in front of the whole country, but then show, for instance, if you, in fact, for instance, change voter suppression, it loosens up everything. The same people that vote against the gay community are the same people that vote against voter suppression, are the same people that vote against healthcare, are the same people that vote against living wages. We need to show that to people. Show them that if you raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, not only do 39 million people come up out of poverty and low wealth, you add some $300+ billion to the gross domestic product, which means the economy is spurred. Same thing with healthcare. If you take one military contract from a bloated military budget, you can fund all 14 states in the South that refuse to accept Medicaid expansion. This moment of COVID, this moment of deep poverty, this moment of deep unemployment, this moment of police violence, death, actually in all of this pain gives us an opportunity to listen to the mourning and the marching in the street and move in a new direction if we do not make our asks and our demands too small. And if we don't get it right in this moment, God help us as a nation. If we can't come together in this moment, God help us as a nation. And I pray that the platform you all draft will speak to all of these issues and will speak clearly to them.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bishop Barber. We raised our minimum wage for our City of Atlanta employees to $15 an hour, and it's been life-changing.
Amen.
Family, so thank you for that.
We're going to get America to follow Atlanta then.
All right.
Get the federal government to follow you.
Thank you. Next, we will have video testimony from Margaret Chaney, and she is from the Tucson Education Association. And as with all who are offering video testimony, if you have any questions, please forward those to the staff and we will make sure that we get answers for you.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Margaret Chaney. I'm the president of the Tucson Education Association, and I've been a teacher in Arizona for 20 years. Most of that time, I've taught high school history and special education. COVID-19 has exposed just how precarious our system is for many people. This has certainly been a challenging time for educators. It's put our brothers and sisters who work as ed support professionals, often for minimum wage, into very difficult circumstances. In many cases, their hours were the first thing to get cut during a pandemic. Make no mistake, their work is essential to our schools' communities, and right now they need more help than they're getting. Today, we're here to talk about restoring the soul of America, but to do that, we need to recognize the work that should have been accomplished before COVID arrived. We can't talk about the soul of America without talking about America's original sin, chattel slavery. Many of my own ancestors came to these shores against their will. In Arizona, the state legislature attempted to erase the stories of minoritized people, like my ancestors, from the mainstream narrative. But we fought back because every one of us is quintessentially American and fundamentally part of the nation's future. Let me say before we go any further that Black lives matter. The promise of our democracy isn't fulfilled until that is true. I'm the mother of a 20-year-old Black man with a steady job and who enjoys classes at the local college, but I'm fearful for his safety every time he leaves the house. I'm fearful of his being judged and condemned to die just for being Black. The talk is the hardest lesson I've ever had to teach my own child. We are not alone. In Arizona, many of our students are part of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program. Since the current administration took office, they have feared for their lives and their families' futures. Fear of violence, fear of illness, fear of deportation, and family separation. We need to do better. In over 20 years of teaching, I've learned that students and parents are counting on us as educators for two things that form the foundation for the rest of our work. Give us the truth and keep them safe. That's what we're charged with, whether it's written in our job descriptions or not. Schools are communities. It all starts with the pursuit of truth and a feeling of safety. Our students count on it and educators are committed to it. They protect their students every day. Educators always go above and beyond, and too often they do so without the funding or support they need from elected officials. But that's what we do. We build trust, we keep kids safe, we create communities. We do this because public education is the cornerstone of our democracy. Restoring the soul of America starts with restoring our sense of community and trust in one another. I'm asking the Biden campaign and the Democratic National Committee to share that commitment to make public schools the focal point of strong communities all over this country. To start, let's invest in our public schools. Let's fully fund IDEA. Let's invest in building more community schools, modernizing unsafe school buildings, expanding broadband access, and respecting all educators enough to provide professional pay. And if we're going to restore America's soul, we need to consider reparations. Institutional racism still shapes American life in too many ways. Shortly after slavery was officially outlawed, it began again covertly under the guise of local Jim Crow laws that devastated communities and families. We see it in housing, education, wealth and income, and the criminal justice system. In Tucson, our schools continue to operate under a desegregation court order. The civil rights movement is not consigned to the past. The work continues, and it will take bold action to overcome the inequality that persists. I find the soul of America in striving to reach the ideals that our country aspires to, not the false nostalgia of the past. Recovery is never easy, but when we do recover from COVID-19 and from the failed Trump-DeVos administration, we need to restore a country that is better than it was, because we don't want a new normal that looks like the same old, same old. We want to build the future that our students deserve. Public education is an optimistic endeavor. Those of us who work in schools believe that we can reach our students and that they can build on the foundation of what previous generations accomplished. They can get closer to that American promise of truth, justice, opportunity, and that all people are created equal. We are in this struggle together, and waging it is a profound act of unity and action. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We next have Alea Eastman, who is the Executive Council member at Team Enough. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, my name is Alea Eastman. I am a rising sophomore at Trinity Washington University in Washington, D.C., and Executive Council member of Team Enough, the youth initiative supported by Brady United Against Gun Violence. During my junior year at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, a gunman opened fire on our school. I survived that day only because Nicholas Dorrit's body shielded me from the beret of bullets as I laid beneath him. He and my other classmate, Helena Ramsey, were both murdered that day, along with 15 others. Adding to trauma, days later, my mother experienced a miscarriage due to stress. But my family knew this pain of gun violence long before Parkland. 16 years ago, my uncle Patrick Edwards was shot in the back and killed. His life mattered. According to the Boston University School of Medicine, the life expectancy for Black men is reduced by 4 years on average because of gun violence. I need you to understand that this violence is a result of poor choices made by policymakers that all too often have racial undertones. The flow of guns into struggling communities of color is often facilitated by white gun store owners who look the other way as traffickers or straw purchasers buy guns that are quickly used to terrorize Black communities. This crisis is not due to a culture of poverty or super predators or any other stereotypes that cast people as inherently violent. Persistent gun violence in communities of color results from centuries of entrenched disadvantages, economic deprivation, and racist policymaking. In many ways, gun violence is the last domino to fall at the end of a long line of racism, trauma, and indifference. But community-based intervention programs have proven that culturally sensitive embedded teams can stop violence before it starts. We must fund that work. It is too easy to buy a gun without a background check. In fact, if a purchaser's background check is not completed in 3 days, a dealer can legally sell the gun. This is how a white supremacist was able to kill 9 innocent Black churchgoers at Mother Emanuel in church in Charleston, South Carolina. I urge you to expand Brady background checks and close the Charleston loophole. The Protection and Lawful Commerce at Arms Act, also known as PLACA, provides the gun industry with special protections at the expense of victims of gun violence. Civil liability holds American industries accountable in other public health crises, like tobacco. Gun violence is also a public health epidemic. The gun industry should not be shielded from civil liability. Imagine how different our country would look. How many more people we would lose to certain cancers or emphysema if the tobacco industry had such protection. Congress must take immediate action to repeal PLACA. Extreme risk laws help protect individuals that pose an immediate danger to themselves or others. I ask you to demand that Congress incentivize states to institute these laws. Assault weapons in high-capacity magazines belong on the battlefield, not in our communities. My classmates and I have seen firsthand what these weapons can do. The Democratic Party should heed Brady's call for federal ban on assault weapons in high-capacity magazines. As we hold the public responsible, we must demand the same from law enforcement. You must lead our nation away from a culture of unequal, punitive authority to one that invests in helping our community to thrive. We must reallocate funds towards improving our schools and creating careers, not just jobs, for those most in need, and do more to protect the most vulnerable, including Black transgender women. In 2018, I testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee during the nomination of Justice Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, and in 2019, before the House Judiciary Committee's first hearing on gun violence in many years. For the past 32 days following the wrongful murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, I have been on the streets of Washington, D.C. with a dynamic group of young Black community organizers called Concerned Citizens DC. We are fighting for a community and a country that values our lives as much as every other American. I am doing all that I can. I am doing my part, and now ask you to ensure that the Democratic Party has my back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alea. Our first question is from Senator Rodriguez.
Alea Eastman, thank you so much for that testimony. Every member of this committee joins me in saying that you survived what no one should have to. And one of the things that we've witnessed is that, like other survivors of the terror of Valentine's Day of 2018, you responded with strength, vulnerability, valor, leadership. And so I want to thank you because you responded and stepped up to educate, advocate, and change. Your testimony talks about the things that we need to do to change. And I'll just, if I could say, you know, here in Florida, we have a long way to go. But in 2018, a few of those things advanced. And one of them made its way into law. And you helped us do that. You all led the way to get through at least part of the brick wall that is the NRA, that is the Republican Party. And, you know, I'll tell you, the mobilization in Tallahassee that year was historic. So when it comes to the disease of gun violence and what we need to accomplish together, you'll find this committee joins you in the commitment, and I appreciate your testimony about what we need to do. But one of the other things that we want to hear about is the how. If you could tell us more about that journey into advocacy and the work that you've done organizing and how you've been able to make change. That's also what we'd like to hear from you today.
Absolutely. I think this conversation of gun violence is very uncomfortable for a lot of folks, but I stress that we need to, you know, become more comfortable with being uncomfortable, because that is how we solve a lot of these issues. For me, coming out of a city like Parkland, where it's predominantly white, affluent community, we saw a lot of students speaking up that didn't look like me. And my advocacy started with me being, you know, someone that could represent a community that deals with gun violence daily, because Parkland isn't a community that deals with gun violence daily. They didn't know about gun violence before Parkland happened on February 14th. So my advocacy stemmed from me being a representation of my city, Brooklyn, that I came from before going to Parkland, and advocating for folks that are like my uncle, Patrick Edwards. So I think this change will start from people actually being a listening ear to folks that often are not allowed in these spaces. And when I say that, I mean Indigenous people, people of color, Black people, people in the LGBTQ+ community. So that is how we start this change, with actually listening to what they need in their communities and what they really want to see pushed forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have a question from Congresswoman Garcia.
Thank you, Mayor, and hello, everyone. And first, Alaya, let me just say to you that no worries. We've got your back, and Joe Biden's got your back. I think it you know, we say it, but it always bears repeating. You know, we know that Black lives do matter, and this platform will reflect that. I know that you and your generation have already gone through so much. Columbine, Sandy Hooks, your own Stonewall Douglas High School. You know, they have, instead of the old fire drills, now they're having mass shooting drills. I mean, it just seems to me that you and your generation have had to grow up with the fear of the possibility that not only it may happen, but when it will happen. So tell me, as someone who didn't really experience that, I remember having the Russians were attacking drills where they taught us to hide underneath the seats. But now you all are just having to go through so much more. Tell me, how does it feel to grow up in a generation where you've got that kind of hanging over you, and what does it feel like, and what insight can you share with us as we put our package together with regard to gun violence?
Absolutely. You know, I was thought I was prepared for a school shooting. I for years planned out what I would do if something like that were to happen, because it is something that, you know, folks see often on the news. So I thought I was fully prepared for it. And, you know, you're not. When you're actually in that situation, things happen where you don't know where the shooter is. You don't know how many shooters there are. So you can't really jump out the window. You can't really, you know, go to the designated corner. And, you know, when we talk about active shooter drills, I want people to realize that that's just a Band-Aid on the real issue. We have to talk about what really stems when we talk about gun violence and what really causes that. We shouldn't be desensitizing young kids to sit in a corner for a shooter to come in and harm them. And folks forget oftentimes that the shooter is a student, so they already know all of those implementations that are put in place. And the drill actually caused a lot of my classmates to die because we were told that whole week that we were going to have an active shooter drill. So a lot of students actually thought that that was a drill, which caused a lot of kids to actually lose their lives. So I think when we talk about active shooter drills, it's really just a Band-Aid on the real issue, and we shouldn't be talking about that. We should really be talking about the root causes of gun violence and why it's so easy for folks to get guns and terrorize communities.
Thank you, Alea.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Mayor. And I just wanted to reminder that we did pass HR 8, our background check bill and our prevention of gun violence bill over a year ago. And of course, the Senate is not acted. So we got your back. Thank you.
Thank you.
My apologies, Congresswoman. Thank you, Alea. Your strength and your courage are just absolutely incredible. We appreciate your joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we will have testimony from Ryan Hampton. He is an author and an advocate for addiction recovery policy reform. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Hampton.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the members of the committee for inviting me here this evening. I'm grateful to be here. 5.5 years ago, I was homeless, hopelessly addicted to heroin, and desperate for help. I knocked on every single door in my community, going from facility to try and find treatment. I put my name on waiting lists that seemed like they stretched for years, went to recovery support groups, and just tried to hang on. Finally, I was given a chance by a facility that actually accepted Medicaid. And I can honestly tell you this evening that if it weren't for Medicaid, I probably would be dead today. In the last couple of years, I have lost dozens of friends, people I loved in my community, who were as desperate, as motivated, and as driven to seek help as I was. They died of preventable overdoses because our healthcare system failed them. I did survive, and I'm here to tell you that if we are to restore the soul of our country, we must make addiction and mental health a priority in this platform. Survival should never be a matter of luck. It should be an opportunity that is extended to every person who wants it the moment they seek help. Access to life-saving recovery support services, treatment, and harm reduction are largely built from community-based efforts such as peer supports and recovery community organizations. Instead of massive investments into the community systems and healthcare supports that saved my life and are backed by well-supported evidence, our communities are experiencing rollbacks, setbacks, and an increase in overdose deaths. The Trump administration's repeated efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act results in deaths of people just like me and just like my friends. When I see the administration's repeated attacks on healthcare, I think that could have been me. I lived because I was lucky, but more than 350 people die every single day in this country due to drugs and alcohol. Now, I'm not here to put myself forward, but to call your attention to the crisis that was already claiming hundreds of thousands of lives before we were hit by COVID-19, and that is the drug epidemic in this country. We are now fighting on two fronts. Coronavirus and addiction combined are a deadly force. Experts are already predicting that we face losing another 70,000 people to overdose and suicide just this year alone related to COVID. At the same time, isolation, fear, and hopelessness place people with substance use disorder at increased risk. As the various arms of our healthcare system are completely overwhelmed and overburdened, now more than ever, it is incredibly apparent that we need a new deal to support addiction and mental health recovery in this country, and we need it fast. Our party's platform must address the many social determinants of health that ultimately lead to substance use disorder. We must prioritize long-term recovery support services, evidence-based treatment, prevention, and harm reduction services that are proven to work and curb overdose deaths. We can get ahead of the curve by listening to, supporting, and investing in the thousands upon thousands of frontline providers and organizations that have spent decades building trust in their own communities. Prioritizing policy developed with evidence and in collaboration with people with lived experience in recovery. Effective criminal justice reform, increasing health equity for all communities, expanding the peer recovery workforce, and finally, enforcing the Mental Health and Addiction Parity Act of 2008. I believe that we can accomplish all of this. Together, we can indeed restore the soul of our nation. But to have a soul, you have got to have a heart. And that means action, not just political platitudes from day one of a new administration and a new Congress that finally offers robust solutions to save lives and end this overdose crisis once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Our first question is from Secretary Vilsack.
Thanks, Mayor. Ryan, thank you very, very much for bringing a very critical issue before this committee. It's one that I have some personal involvement with. My mom suffered from alcoholism and prescription drug addiction, and I know the pain, I know the challenge, and I know that the help needs to be there when the individual is ready, willing, and able to take a step towards recovery. I wonder if you could take a minute of your time and our time tonight to share with us how addiction impacts families and communities. I think sometimes we focus obviously on those who are addicted, but there's a much larger set of people impacted and affected by addiction. And perhaps you could give us a bit of insight about family and community.
Yes, thank you for the question, Mr. Secretary. I mean, as they say, addiction impacts not just the family, it impacts the entire community. You know, I always drive back on my own experience as a person who was needing help for well over a decade. My mother, my sisters, my friends, we were completely isolated. Part of the problem, though, was that when I was ready to ask for help, qualified help wasn't there, ready to receive me as a patient. The community supports were not in place, not only to not support me as someone who needed help, but also to support my family. We need to create an infrastructure that isn't just providing treatment, acute treatment to the person who needs it right away, but recovery support services that support the family as a whole. I will tell you that my family, we experienced so much as a family unit together that was negative while I was using and while I was seeking help. But once I was able, and again, I would like to say it was by a stroke of luck. I am not sitting here today because the system worked. I am sitting here because I was lucky, right? Because I was able to make it into recovery, though, my family has also recovered as well. My mother could have used support services and people, mentors, a peer mentorship model, just like I had when I was in early recovery, and that was not available to her on a qualified basis. So when we address substance use disorder, we cannot leave out the family systems that are so important to the holistic approach to combating the overdose crisis.
Well said. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Congresswoman Clark has a question.
Thank you so much, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Brian, for joining us and for your powerful personal testimony. I think when when people like you come forward and tell their story of recovery, it helps us reduce the stigma around seeking mental health treatment and substance use disorder treatment. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. And I also would like your comments on what federal programs we could implement that could make the most impactful change and provide the most relief for people struggling with addiction?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. You know, some people do use the word stigma. It is stigma, but I would go a step further. For many of the friends of mine who actually were in the process of seeking help and were denied help, some of them at healthcare facilities and large hospital settings, because they were labeled as an addict or as a junkie. They were seen as second, third, fourth class citizens of this country. I would go as far to say that it isn't just stigma, it's discrimination. It is prejudice against people who use drugs. It is prejudice against people who are in recovery. I know many people who are in long-term recovery today who have issues with accessing employment, who have issues with accessing housing, basic needs because of their recovery status. So at a certain level, it goes beyond stigma and becomes discrimination. To combat that, though, on a positive note, I'd like to quote actually a former drug czar who actually served under many Republican administrations and has worked with many Democrats as well. His name's Dr. Robert DuPont. He served 17 White House drug czars and 14 heads of the DEA. Dr. DuPont recently said, and I quote, "There's a lot of discouragement in our field and a lot of frustration, but there's one thing that's still growing, and that is the recovery movement." That's our answer, Dr. DuPont said. 25 million strong and growing. We can look to that community for what to do and how they're doing it. I believe the more people like myself and my community and others who have been impacted by substance use disorder, the more that we step up and not just tell our stories, but get involved in the Democratic platform, get involved in our local communities, let people know what recovery is and what it looks like. We can shatter that discrimination. We can shatter those biases against people who are currently struggling and people who are in long-term recovery. Regarding your question on the federal level, what I would suggest and hope is we have seen some federal investment. The Trump administration likes to claim big victories on the opioid crisis. This is way bigger than an opioid crisis. We have an addiction and mental health crisis. Right now in the Western states, I'm in my state of Nevada, we are seeing more overdose deaths due to methamphetamine than we are opioids. We need to be looking at all drugs, including alcohol. So federal funding that comes down needs to be inclusive of all substances and not just opioids, because the next drug crisis is right around the corner if we don't address it that way. Secondly, I would say there has been while the focus on treatment is incredibly important, the focus on evidence-based care when it comes to treatment and prevention is incredibly important. Because of that, we have not seen the type of investments that we need in long-term recovery supports. So I had been to treatment well over half a dozen times. I was never able to sustain my recovery and came close to death and overdose multiple times. What we need is an investment in the infrastructure, a recovery-oriented system of care that gets people past those first couple of years and past that fifth year. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, under President Obama, issued the first ever Surgeon General's report on addiction, alcohol, and drugs called Facing Addiction in America. That report stated that if we can get someone past 5 years, they have an 85% chance at sustaining their recovery for the rest of their lives. That report now has been sitting, I'm convinced, on some bookshelf in Health and Human Services, just collecting dust, because we are doing very little that was recommended to the federal government in 2016. The answer is in that report. The answer is in investing in those long-term recovery supports and making recovery real, attainable, and sustainable for every single American that desires it.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for living Dr. DuPont's call to action. We really appreciate your testimony.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to assume that report is next to the pandemic handbook that was left behind as well. So thank you. Next, we have testimony from Elizabeth O'Brien. This is a pre-taped video. She is the Chief Executive Officer of the Freedom Learning Group.
Good afternoon, distinguished members of the committee. My name is Elizabeth Bryan. I'm a CEO of a multi-million-dollar company committed to hiring military spouses and veterans. I'm an Army spouse of 14 years, a mother of 3 Army brats who have lived all over the world. I stand before you to represent millions of voices of our veterans and our military families. For over 20 years, we've been carrying the nation's wars on our families' backs through sustained warfare with impacts that will take decades to unravel. But what I know and what we know is that our challenges and our solutions represent so many of the same issues that occur for Americans at large. We face staggering unemployment numbers for our military spouses. We need and have earned the right to accessible mental health care and child care. We are literally the soul of America. Well over a decade ago, our country emerged from recession, but our military spouses, a population that's 92% female, remained in that recession. We have learned over the past several months that companies and CEOs who did not heed our call to provide remote and portable jobs are quite capable. And those jobs that have shown to be remote now in times of crisis need to remain. They need to be provided to our military spouses and our military families so that we don't choose to leave the service and pursue economic opportunity that will place us on par with our civilian counterparts. Moving forward, innovative solutions must be used to reskill and upskill our military spouses. Access to community colleges, apprenticeships, and fellowships must be provided as millions of jobs will disappear as a result of COVID. And we must continue to remove the burden of regulation around licensing and credentialing across states that can obstruct the military spouse entering the workforce, as we are 10 times more likely to move across state lines. Families leave the workforce every day because they don't have accessible childcare, and every day military families choose to leave their service because of lack of accessible childcare. We must explore options to create flexible spending accounts and expansion of fee assistance program, both of which will support the ability to seek childcare outside the gates due to long wait lists and minimal options. As we face the fall of 2020 with many schools already releasing guidance that children will attend school virtually, military families at large will have little to no options or access to childcare. If there was ever a time to create an emergency childcare solution, it is today. Isolation, loneliness, mental health, and wellness are having severe impacts on our military families and our veterans. According to the 2019 Military Family Advisory Network survey, we are facing obstacles when seeking mental health care due to lack of appointments, times to attend, and concerns around career implications. Local community providers must stand ready to accept and provide culturally competent care to our military families and provide alternative solutions. With more than 200,000 members transitioning out every day, we are coming home to your communities. Our military families are carrying decades of sacrifice driven by our belief in America. What we believe, what we stand for is the same as Americans across the country. We are the very soul of America. Members of the committee, I thank you for the opportunity to testify.
And committee members, again, if you have questions for Ms. O'Brien, please email those questions to our staff and we will be sure to get a response for you. Next up, we have Mr. Terrence Wise. Mr. Wise is a McDonald's worker working on the Fight for 15 minimum wage movement and for a union with the help of SEIU. Thank you, Mr. Wise, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, everyone. My name is Terrence Wise, and I'm a McDonald's worker from Kansas City, Missouri, and a leader in the Fight for 15 and the union movement. I'm a second-generation fast food worker. My mom worked for Hardee's for 30 years, and my dad was a cook in the military. I watched as my family struggled while I grew up. And although I excelled in high school, the struggle soon got to me too. By the age of 16, I was working 2 jobs so that I could help my mom get the lights turned back on. I've been in the fast food industry ever since, over 20 years. Me and my fiance and our 3 daughters have struggled to survive. Twice we've become homeless due to our low wages. 7 years ago, I joined the Fight for 15 and the union movement because I am determined to give my daughters a better life than the one I've had. Now, how can we truly restore the soul of America? You know, we're almost 4 years into a brutal Trump administration. I've seen the Raise the Wage Act, a national $15 an hour wage law, get passed on the floor of the House. I was there, only to die on the floor of the Senate. Trump and the Republican Party have also been pouring gasoline on the fire of racism that have been killing so many and tearing our nation apart at the seams. Now, we must defeat Donald Trump, but that alone will not be enough. We need bold leadership. It's what the American people and workers are crying out for. I'll be 41 next week, y'all. And all my working life, since 16, I've watched as the working class have sunk like a battleship. Wages are declining, unions are all but being wiped out, benefits are evaporating, deaths of despair are plaguing our urban, rural, and suburban communities. Black and brown workers like myself have been at the bottom of the wreckage. But let's not forget, our white sisters and brothers they're going down with us. We cannot restore the soul of America if we do not restore the bold vision of America as a land where all people are created equal, regardless of your skin color, and where a promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is real. It's time to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour nationwide. The Democratic Party and a Biden presidency must make this a national priority in the first 100 days of the administration. The coronavirus and the ongoing calls for racial justice have only added to the desperate need for $15 an hour for all of America. Essential workers like me and my coworkers at McDonald's and my fiance, who's a home healthcare worker, we're risking our lives every day for poverty wages. But that's not all, y'all. If we're gonna address the rot that's destroying our economy, our nation, we need to do more. We need to make sure that we have an economy that is built on and built by good jobs. That means unions for all. Unions for all is about bringing America together, bringing democracy into the workplace, and making our economy work for us instead of the other way around. It's about making sure our pledge to be one nation indivisible with liberty and justice for all becomes a reality. Now, over the past few years, we've stood with candidates for the Democratic nomination, and I want to personally thank Joe Biden for showing up at our McDonald area strikes and calling for a unionization of McDonald's workers. That's the kind of support we need from our elected leaders. And as the past few months have shown with the COVID-19 and the Black for Lives movement, we need this union so that we can not only win higher wages, but win protective equipment, paid sick leave, health care, and an end to discrimination and structural racism. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wise. Our first question is from President Applebaum.
Thank you, Mayor. And Terrence, thank you for being here today to talk about the work you and the Fight for 15 have been doing across the country. I couldn't agree more with what you have said tonight. And I'm proud to say that my union, and especially our retail workers, stood side by side with fast food workers to make $15 an hour in New York State possible. And I think it's important for people to understand the difference it's made in people's lives. Can you say more about what a nationwide $15 minimum wage would mean to families like yours?
Definitely. As I mentioned, my family has become homeless twice due to low wages. And that's what 15 means. It's just a start. It's the floor. It's not the ceiling. But it's the difference between being homeless and having a place to lay your head. It's the difference between having food on the table, being able to get my kids new shoes. And it's much more, and I know you know, Stuart, than just a $15 an hour wage. We need a union, as I described, to have protections in the workplace. We need democracy in the workplace.
That's a great answer. I want to thank you. I also hope you have a happy birthday next week. I know that the work you're doing is going to make sure that other people's birthdays are going to be happy too. Thank you, Terrence. Keep it up.
Thank you. Our next question is from Dr. Gottney.
Hi, Mr. Wise. Thank you so much for your testimony, and thanks for your activism and your fight for 15, and also your fight for unionism. I really appreciate that. In addition to raising the federal minimum wage to a living wage and strengthening collective bargaining in America, what policies or programs do you think the federal government should immediately invest in to raise the quality of life for working class people?
Well, you know, when that question comes, I think that, you know, our duty as the working class and as Americans, I think over the past 7 years in the fight for 15 in the union, our motto is to do whatever it takes. And we've done that. I've been on strike. I've committed civil disobedience. I've sat in the middle of Times Square and been arrested, you know. So we've done everything as workers to help lift wages. And the federal government, our elected leaders have a lot of power. You know, it's companies like McDonald's and many others that get contracts from the federal government. And those contracts should have standards, you know, $15 wage, treatment and, you know, better treatment for workers, give workers the ability to unionize. You know, we're in the 21st century, but we have labor laws that were written in the 1930s. So we need elected leaders and our members of our government to not only rewrite the rules, to create an environment where it's easier for us to unionize and lift wages, but it's really truly time for action. So for our elected leaders to use the power and everything in their means to make this a reality for us.
Thank you. All right, thank you, and happy birthday, Mr. Wise.
Thank you.
Next, we will hear from Jimmy Williams. Mr. Williams is the General Vice President at the International Union of Painters and Allied Trades.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening, members of the committee. As a fourth generation trade unionist, I just want to say I'm proud to follow my brother Terrence there in the words he spoke about our great labor movement. And I appreciate the opportunity tonight to speak to the members of the committee. Our union at the Painters and International Trades, we are a construction union. We make up 140,000 members. We're a part of the over 3.5 million members of the North America's building trades unions. We're proud workers that work throughout every sector of the economy. We work in building bridges, roads, highways, schools, airports, affordable housing, new energy, broadband, and rail expansion. And after years of abysmal infrastructure grades by the American Society of Civil Engineers, I'm happy to say today, thank you to the House Democratic leadership for the work they did this week in moving forward the Moving American Forward Act. But we know that there's still so much work to be done. The Senate still has to take up the bill, and President Trump and all of his failed rhetoric from 4 years ago when he campaigned on promises of America's infrastructure being invested in and never followed through has work to be done. This issue has divided many of the working class in the construction sector. We've fallen for failed promises by the administration, and we won't accept it again. We call on this committee here to adopt in its platform that all infrastructure spending attach to labor standards that have been attached for generations, like project labor agreements, like Davis-Bacon and prevailing wage protections, and the continued utilization of federal approved apprenticeship programs, the proven pathway to the middle class. The Republican response to infrastructure is and has always been to change the tax codes of this country to promote public-private partnerships. We call on this committee as well to adopt in the platform that any public-private partnerships that entice private equity and private spending in America's infrastructure also include those labor standards like federal approved apprenticeship programs, prevailing wage and Davis-Bacon standards, and project labor agreements. We at the Painters and International Union of Allied Trades, we support a climate and jobs plan that addresses the crisis of inequality and climate change head on. But this plan has to include labor standards as well. We support the shift away from the old energy to the new. We support it 100%. But we have to make sure that we bring with those jobs the same labor protections that built the America's infrastructure of the old, and that the skills that our members use today are used to apply in the energy of tomorrow. And with that, I thank the chair and I thank the members of the committee.
Thank you. Our first question is from President Trumpka.
Thank you, Mayor Bottoms. Good to see you, Brother Williams. How are you? First of all, let me thank you for your entire family's dedication to the working people of this country. All the contributions you've made to reskill and to highly skill the workers in this country. I want to say thank you for that. You know, Jim, a lot of people in this country think that America's infrastructure is the envy of the world, as it used to be. Is that true? And would you describe to us really what the state of America's infrastructure is? What effect is it having on our ability and our competitiveness? And tell us this, what would a large infrastructure bill mean to the members of the IPUT and to workers in general?
America's infrastructure has continuously received the failing grade from the American Society of Civil Engineers. And a failing grade is not acceptable in the richest country in the United States, in the globe. But what a bold infrastructure package means to not only the members of our union, but to the countless millions of Americans that are currently unemployed because of the economic crisis that came through COVID-19 and the lack of response that our government has had. It is a pathway to future jobs. Creating America's infrastructure jobs is not only for union members of today, but it's for future union members. It's to build the affordable housing that's needed in the cities and states in this country. It's to put people to work in the communities they live. It's to put people through apprenticeship programs with good paying jobs and benefits and retirement security and healthcare on the back end. A bold plan for America's infrastructure was what President Trump promised and hasn't delivered. And what this party can do, and with what a candidate like Joe Biden can do, it can be that bold future and win back the soul of America.
Jim, you talked about the prevailing wage and Davis-Bacon. Before I let you go, can you explain to us what prevailing wage and Davis-Bacon is and why it's so important to American workers?
Sure. Davis-Bacon is a critical piece to ensuring that workers are paid the proper wages for the projects that they perform. Whenever the federal government invests in infrastructure, the contractors that work in America's infrastructure are to pay an area wage and benefit that is equal to the prevailing area standard. And it ensures the fact that local workers get paid the proper local wages so that folks are not brought in and that a race to the bottom doesn't occur. And it's been the tradition of this country since the 1930s. And it has ensured a pathway, and it has kept a good, sound living for many a generation of middle-class construction workers. And it's under attack by the Republican right every single time an America's infrastructure bill is taken up on the House floor or on the Senate floor. And we applaud the Democratic Party for continuing to keep it a part of their platform, and we hope to see so in the future.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from President Applebaum.
Jimmy, it's good to see you, and thank you for being here. Project labor agreements and union jobs mean good jobs with good wages. When people hear the words project labor agreements, many understand that to mean prevailing wages, but we both know that labor standards also mean worker protections. Can you say more about what specific protections you would like to see in place to protect workers and to ensure the best possible working conditions?
Sure. Number one, on any federal funded, whether direct or indirect, we should support and continue to support the utilization of project labor agreements. Project labor agreements are not just prevailing wages. They ensure that collective bargaining is a right on a construction project. We should push and include in the platform neutrality agreements so that government's money is not used to be spent against workers' rights to organize on construction sites as well. Project labor agreements go way beyond just ensuring wage standards. They go to job protections such as collective bargaining and other rights under the National Labor Relations Act, and we should continue to support them Sadly, though, the administration and other arms of the government have done nothing to move towards enacting project labor agreements on federally funded projects under this administration.
Jimmy, thank you. Well said.
Thank you for joining us this evening, Mr. Williams.
Thank you.
We will now hear from Laura Rosenberger. Ms. Rosenberger is the Director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy and a Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the committee for inviting me to speak with you today. Over the next several decades, competition between democracy and authoritarianism will be a defining feature of geopolitics. Americans' way of life is at stake. Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping believe that holding on to power requires making the world safe for autocracies, and they are exporting digital authoritarian and kleptocratic tools to undermine democracies around the world. For liberal democracy to survive, the United States needs to redouble our commitment to democratic values at home and abroad, restore our credibility with our democratic partners and allies, and update our institutions to meet these challenges. There has long been debate in foreign policy about how to balance America's values and its interests, as if the two were separable. But in this global contest between authoritarian and democratic systems, democratic values are our interests and our competitive advantage. Democracy must be a national security priority. In the global competition between democracies and autocracies, Donald Trump sides with the autocrats. This is a feature of his worldview, not a bug. We can draw a line from his 1990 praise of the Tiananmen massacre as showing, quote, the power of strength, to his reported comments to Xi Jinping that building concentration camps in Xinjiang is, quote, the right thing to do. He's consistently praised Putin as a, quote, strong leader and bashed the press while standing next to him. Trump doesn't just admire autocrats, he encourages them. Meanwhile, Trump emulates them at home, attacking the press, threatening to use our military to quell peaceful protesters, spreading disinformation, and stoking racism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia to consolidate power. And his administration is gutting the tools of international broadcasting and open technology that are essential for challenging autocratic rulers. Instead, the United States needs to practice what we preach, putting our values front and center at home and abroad. As Beijing and Moscow seek to extend the authoritarian model, the United States needs to strengthen the competitive offer of democracy, not imitate our adversaries. This starts at home, including with many of the issues that the preceding witnesses have so eloquently spoken to. Cracks in our democracy not only weaken us, but create vulnerabilities for autocrats to exploit. Strengthening our free press, ensuring free, fair, and secure elections, addressing systemic racism and economic inequality, and ensuring the digital information space promotes quality information, not hate and conspiracies. These steps are essential to restoring our credibility. We need to show that democracy produces results that benefit people, not just politicians or corporations. This requires breaking down stovepipes between foreign, domestic, and economic policy, updating our institutions to tackle these challenges and promote new partnerships across sectors. Our democratic allies are starting to mount efforts to push back on authoritarianism, but today they find themselves alone without a reliable partner in the United States. We need to work with our allies and partners to address shared threats, bolstering democracy and countering authoritarianism, addressing threats to human rights and dignity, combating climate change, and building a technological infrastructure that supports and enables democracy. The United States global retreat under the Trump administration has created space for authoritarians. This is true not just in geographic terms, but in multilateral bodies where the US has pulled back, only to be replaced by China. Renewing our commitment to multilateralism while updating these bodies will be critical to preserving and protecting democracy. I have no doubt that American democracy can prevail in this contest with authoritarians, but doing so requires new leadership dedicated to restoring our values and marshaling the world in this struggle. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Our first question is from Julie Smith.
Thank you, Mayor Bottoms, and thank you, Laura, for your testimony this evening. Traditionally, when you think about U.S. national security, you think about those 3 Ds. You think about development, you think about diplomacy, and you think about defense. But in recent years, it seems like one of the lessons for the national security community has been to focus on technology and the fact that we are finding that countries like Russia and China are relying on technology to execute very sophisticated disinformation campaigns. We're finding that other countries like Russia are interfering in elections and undermining democratic governments, not just our own, but others in Europe among our closest allies. So when you think about the technology piece, how would you advise a Biden administration to insert technology into its national security platform?
Well, thanks, Julie. I think it's such an important issue. Technology is one of the key areas where this contest between democracy and authoritarianism is taking place. Beijing and Xi Jinping under his leadership has really harnessed technology as a means of transmitting its values externally and of gaining power by controlling the technological infrastructure through which data and information flows. The United States needs to work much more closely with its democratic allies, not only to think about building a technological infrastructure that actually supports and enables democracy, but thinking about how we actually build for the future. So right now we see platforms that are built in the United States, built for surveillance capitalist purposes with a model that makes money off of hateful and conspiratorial content in order to get ad dollars. That model of surveillance capitalism is actually very vulnerable to being exploited and perverted by actors who seek to undermine democracy. We need to think about what are the technological infrastructures that actually enable and support democracy. But we also have to think more broadly. I mean, right now we see China in particular through its Belt and Road Initiative, its Digital Silk Road component of that, actually seeking to export its digital authoritarian tactics and infrastructure to other countries in places like Africa and Latin America. And in a future in which we may actually see a bifurcated internet, it's extraordinarily important to think about who's going to end up on what side of that internet and what that means for how the United States actually works together to make our tent as big as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Mr. Orton.
Hey, Laura, thanks for joining us today. Our mutual friend, Matt Duss, says hello. I appreciate your testimony about Trump's almost admiration of authoritarian leaders internationally, and I think we can probably safely add Saudi Arabia to the list. But I think one of the elements of his kinship almost with these authoritarians is beyond just their state power, but also their tendency to use their state power to enrich themselves, right? The corruption and authoritarianism kind of play hand in hand. What do we need to do post-Trump, especially given he's sort of tried to model these authoritarians? What do we need to do to address that kind of corruption connected to authoritarians in a new administration?
Well, thanks so much, Josh, and my best to Matt. And just as Julie pointed out, technology is an area that we haven't always thought about in the national security space. I think corruption and kleptocracy has also been an area that's, often fallen in the feel-good category of a values thing that we promote, but not necessarily a core interest that we actually think about, one where we really need to tackle it centrally. And I think that needs to change. There is no question that kleptocracy is not only a means through which rulers in Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, elsewhere actually gain and hold power. It's also a way that they use those tools to attack and weaken their adversaries, right? So when we see, dirty money flowing into democracies in covert ways in order to curry favor, as we've seen in a number of European countries, as we've seen China do in Australia, as there's been cases here in the United States, it's extraordinarily important that we understand the deeply corrupting effect that has on our democracy, weakening us from within while empowering the very autocrats with whom we're trying to compete. So taking steps at home, like, beneficial ownership, right? I mean, this is something that we are so close in Congress to being able to get this done. For anyone who doesn't know beneficial ownership legislation, it would eliminate the ability to hide money through shell companies. and other transparency mechanisms are so critical to this. This is another area where the intersection between domestic policy, foreign policy, and economic policy that I spoke to in my testimony is so clear. This is an issue that cuts across all three, and we really have to understand it and see it in that way. Transparency and other democratic principles here are our friends, and we absolutely need to double down on those priorities as we think about how to counter kleptocracy as a way of strengthening democracy and weakening authoritarians.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much for joining us. Next, we will have Lisa Rice. Ms. Rice is the president and CEO of the National Fair Housing Alliance.
Chairwoman Bottoms and members of the committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you about fighting for the soul of America. In this nation, where you live matters. Your address determines everything about you, your chances of graduating from high school or college, getting arrested, your net worth, your ability to own a home. It impacts your credit score or how long you will live. Your zip code is actually a better determinant of your health than your genetic code. When you look at our residential and lending patterns, we are a century behind where we need to be. In terms of racial wealth and homeownership gaps and segregation, we're actually living in 1890. Residential segregation is the bedrock of inequality, and it exacerbates today's affordable housing crisis. Our markets aren't fair. They don't work for people of color, women, and people with disabilities. Whites have 10 times the wealth of Blacks and 8 times the wealth of Latinos. Lending redlining is flourishing in the United States. Housing discrimination is still the norm in too many communities. The bias in our markets is not a bug, but a feature. They were intentionally built to operate in a discriminatory fashion, and they'll continue to do so until we make systemic and cultural changes. From the inception of this nation, our housing and finance policies were explicitly discriminatory. They created biased systems that still exist today: residential segregation, the dual credit market, and other unfair systems. We continue to see disparities in discrimination because we haven't dismantled these structures of inequality. We need change, and that change will be uncomfortable. Because we are so far behind, we need bold action. We must do 3 things: strengthen and fully enforce anti-discrimination laws, dismantle structural barriers that create and perpetuate bias and replace them with systems that are fair and equitable, and change our culture. Specifically, we must eliminate the dual credit market and abolish all forms of predatory lending, make a huge dent in reducing residential and school segregation, fully invest in formerly redlined and currently underserved communities in ways that generate wealth for current residents and protect them from displacement, create new lending models that spur homeownership and credit opportunities for underserved groups, address AI and tech bias that drive discrimination in hidden ways, implement comprehensive protections for renters to stem the tide of homelessness and prevent housing instability, and finally, provide reparations for communities impacted by race-based economic violence. And with that, I thank you so much, Chair and members of the committee.
Thank you so much for joining us. Our first question is from Congresswoman Clark.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Ms. Rice, for joining us. This week, we had a devastating study come out of Boston in which 71% of the Black renters were discriminated against in the cases that they tested. And so it's tempting to look to AI to try and address this kind of discrimination. I hope you can elaborate on your testimony that there can be hidden discrimination in AI and a tech bias and ways that we might be able to address that.
Sure, thank you for the question. So the major challenge is that most of our AI systems are built with data that has bias baked into that data. So for example, if you look at lending underwriting systems, risk-based pricing systems, credit scoring systems, insurance scoring systems, all of those systems are built using data from the financial sector. Most of the data is culled from credit repositories. The problem is that that data is not innocuous. It's not benign. It has bias and discriminatory impacts seeped into, sort of soaked into the actual data. And unfortunately, whatever the inherent features are of the data that you're using when you're building an AI system, those inherent features are going to be manifest in the outcomes that are generated from the AI systems. So if you're using biased data in your systems, you're going to get biased results. Researchers at Berkeley University did an analysis using data, very homogeneous data from the GSEs, from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They looked at the impact of risk-based, AI risk-based pricing systems on consumers. And what they found is that African Americans and Latinos who had the same financial characteristics as their white counterparts were charged more. They were surcharged. So the AI system actually charged African Americans and Latinos more, to the tune of over $750 million per year. So African Americans and Latinos were not paying a price that was commensurate with their level of risk. The challenge, the problem is that while we have what we call debiasing techniques, so these are algorithmic-based mathematical formulas that can diminish or stifle the bias in AI systems, most companies are not using those debiasing techniques when they build their algorithms, when they build their artificial intelligence or algorithmic-based systems. And unfortunately, our regulators in the financial space, so our financial regulators are not requiring corporations to use these debiasing techniques. And that's one of the things that has to change, and that will help change some of those systemic issues that I talked about in my oral testimony.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Mr. Graves has our next question.
Thank you, Chair Bottoms, and thank you, Ms. Rice, for your testimony and for all the work you and the National Fair Housing Alliance are doing to ensure housing access for all Americans. Point of personal privilege, I want to thank you for the great work that you did here in the great state of Ohio to protect Ohioans from predatory lenders and ensure access to quality credit and equal housing. You've spoken forcefully today about the need to raise awareness about the challenges in our housing system. We see on a daily basis the ways that too many families in our nation are being kept out of safe and affordable housing, like a proposed rollback of the affirmatively furthering fair housing provision of the Fair Housing Act, and the resulting harmful and cascading impacts on those families generation after generation. I'm hoping you can talk to us about the ways that residential segregation is also linked to the disparities we're seeing related to the COVID-19 pandemic and economic crisis.
Sure, thank you for the question. I'd be happy to. You know, we say that residential segregation is the bedrock of inequality in this nation, and that's because segregation creates opportunities to direct which communities will get certain resources and which communities will be deprived of certain resources or critical investments. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Because of segregation, what we see is that communities that get investments, those investments often spur other investments in other areas. Likewise, communities that are deprived of investments, that has a ripple effect too, and those communities get deprived of investments across many sectors. And unfortunately, what we now have is a scenario where African Americans and Latinos predominantly living in hyper-segregated neighborhoods are living in communities that are health deserts, food deserts, credit deserts, transportation deserts, education deserts, water deserts, job deserts. So there's this intersectionality when it comes to how disinvestments and residential segregation is impacting these neighborhoods and communities. So for example, people of color are less likely to live in a neighborhood where there is a full service grocery store or some type of facility that is providing healthy foods. Only 8% of African Americans live in a census tract with a full service grocery store. So if you are not living in a neighborhood where you can easily access healthy foods, then how are you going to keep yourself healthy and keep your children healthy? If you're eating unhealthy foods, you're more likely to have diabetes, you're more likely to have hypertension. And of course, those comorbidities exacerbate whether or not you are going to get infected with the COVID virus and of course, unfortunately, ultimately die from it. People of color disproportionately live in what we call water deserts. So they're living in shelters, they're living in housing where they do not have access to healthy and clean water. People of color disproportionately live in health deserts. They disproportionately are living in communities where there are no hospitals, no doctor's offices, no dentist offices. And so it's very hard for people to maintain their health when there's no healthcare provider in their community. People of color disproportionately live in areas with toxic and hazardous features and components. In fact, race is the single most significant predictor of whether a person will live in a neighborhood with contaminated land, air, or water. The last example I'll give you relates to credit. People of color disproportionately live in credit deserts, and that's one of the reasons why African Americans and Latinos, on average, have credit and insurance scores that are lower than our white brothers and sisters. So people of color disproportionately live in communities where there are no bank branches or no mainstream lenders, but conversely, there are a plethora of payday lenders and check cashers and other high-cost lenders. And I want to point out finally that this is not a matter of economics. This is not an issue of economics. It's an issue of race. Right now, as we speak, banks, mainstream banks, are closing their branches in high-income, affluent Black neighborhoods at a higher rate than they're closing their branches in low-income, non-Black neighborhoods. So the inequality is really steeped in our racialized legacy that has created residential segregation. And unfortunately, because we haven't dismantled those structures of bias and inequality, the discriminatory outcomes are just continuing to perpetuate.
Thank you so much for raising those really critical points and providing a great playbook for the Biden administration.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rice. I'm a living example of that. I live in a predominantly African-American community in Atlanta, and there is a 10-year life expectancy difference with a predominantly white community, not even 10 miles from my home. So thank you. Next, we will have a pre-tape video from Dmytro Salford. He is on the front lines as president of the Missouri State Council of Firefighters and president of St. Louis IAFF Local 73. And we thank him for his service and the service of all of our first responders. And again, if you have any questions, please email those questions.
and emergency. Good evening. My name is Dmytro Salford. I'm a member of the International Association of Firefighters, which represent over 320,000 professional firefighters and emergency medical personnel working hard every day to serve our communities on the front lines of emergencies large and small, including serving as the nation's primary EMS responders to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like to thank the Democratic Platform Committee for the opportunity to participate in this important drafting process. As frontline workers to the COVID-19 pandemic, firefighters bear the brunt of the impact resulting from the failures of the current administration to prepare for and respond to the current national health emergency. Firefighters believe that, as a nation, we must support emergency response employees by ensuring they have the proper resources and funding to do their jobs, serving their communities while staying safe and healthy. Thus, the federal government should serve as a partner to states and cities in ensuring such employees have sufficient staffing, equipment, and training to respond to emergencies of all sizes and scope. Protecting workers' safety and health also means the federal government must care for emergency response employees who incur illness due to their line of work. Those who serve the public have earned coverage and care from the public, and workers who contract occupational illnesses, including mental health challenges, should be properly compensated and cared for. As Democrats, we value workers and the work they do to serve our community every day as well as in time of crisis, and the party platform should reflect these values. Firefighters support the right of all workers to join a union and have a voice in the workplace regarding wages, hours, and working conditions. We support the right of workers and all Americans to have a good health care by building upon and expanding the Affordable Care Act while protecting high-quality health care plans the unions have negotiated with their employers. We support the right of workers to have a secure retirement by protecting defined benefit pensions and allowing workers who retire early, like firefighters, to purchase health coverage through Medicare. These policies do not only help provide for a secure livelihood and a secure retirement, they provide for a secure economy that benefits all Americans. These are our values as firefighters, as Democrats, and as Americans. On behalf of the International Association of Firefighters and our nation's domestic defenders, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to share our perspective on the party platform. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next up, we have Heather McTeer-Toney, who is the National Field Director of the Moms Clean Air Force. Ms. Toney also served as the first African-American, first female, and youngest mayor of Greenville, Mississippi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Heather McTeer-Toney, and I am a National Field Director for Moms Clean Air Force. I've also served as the Regional Administrator for EPA in the Southeast, as well as being a fellow mayor. 100, that is the number of environmental protections the Trump administration has reversed within the past 3.5 years. 100% of those 100 rollbacks disproportionately harm Black and Brown Indigenous communities across our nation. 100% of these actions are worsening the impacts of coronavirus and destroying future climate benefits for our children every single day. Under Administrator Andrew Wheeler, EPA has decimated the legal justifications of the Mercury and Air Toxic Standard Rule, replaced the Clean Power Plan, lifted controls on toxic air pollutions on communities, and cut pollution protections for waterways that were previously regulated under the Clean Water Act. Trump's EPA has done this and so much more, even under the cover of a global pandemic wreaking havoc across our country. At Moms Clean Air Force, we even began keeping a calendar of the actions EPA was taking during the midst of the coronavirus, and we were astounded to see the racist agenda pushed faster under the cover of sickness and death. And we don't need to look far to see the very real, very prevalent, and very urgent problems that this has caused. A preliminary study from Harvard University showed that cities with a higher rate of air pollution had a higher rate of death from coronavirus. In Houston, Texas, residents experienced high ozone days even while staying at home. And it wasn't due to traffic, but due to age-old pollution from the petrochemical industry. And instead of tightening enforcement to protect people, EPA chose to limit enforcement of environmental regulations and gave companies more flexibility to self-regulate. They even weakened the rules on monitoring, meaning we have no official federal data on just how bad the pollution really is. One of the first reported Houston coronavirus deaths came from the community of Pleasantville, a historically Black working class neighborhood surrounded by transportation and industrial pollution on all sides. And while this community has been a strong advocate for pollution controls, they were among the first to give their lives for it. And the stories are repeated almost line for line in communities across the country, the St. John community in Louisiana, Turkey Creek in Mississippi, Marietta, Cobb County, Georgia, the list goes on and on. But there's good news. There's things that we can do on day one of a new administration to put us on a path for transformative future. We can stop all Trump rollbacks in the pipeline and put all litigation on hold. Let's bring a halt to the human from people on the front lines of air pollution that are simply fighting to breathe in their own living rooms and porches. We can issue executive orders compelling all federal agencies to use existing law and authority to enact immediate and equitable environmental provisions. And we can put our money where our mouth is with a substantial and pointed budget request. All air pollution is a slow and silent killer, and it's responsible for over 7 million deaths annually. It's particularly hard on our children and elderly, especially those with a weakened immune system. Communities of color have suffered enough, and we must restore the soul and justice in every breath of America by placing this issue as a top priority for a future administration. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our first question is from Congresswoman Holland.
Thank you so much, Madam Mayor. Thank you for being here, and thank you so much for the work you do so that our kids have clean air. I'm a huge fan of Mom's Clean Air Force and meet with them in my state and here in Washington, D.C. as well. I know from your work, or from our work on the House Natural Resources Committee, how impactful your work has been and can be. And as you mentioned, the Trump administration has launched an all-out assault on our environment while cutting our public lands. Currently, our public lands emit 25% of carbon into the atmosphere, and that's what we all breathe. And I completely understand about your link between polluted air and the coronavirus. Our state of New Mexico is home to the largest methane cloud floating above the northwest corner of the state. It can be seen from space, and it won't surprise you to know that it's right above the Navajo Nation, and the Navajo Nation has the highest rate of COVID cases in our state, over 50%, when Native Americans are only 11% of the population. You mentioned the egregious and negatively impactful rollbacks of this administration. And what specifically should President Biden do immediately to take the steps necessary to make our air better?
Congresswoman, thank you for that question, and thank you for being such a wonderful friend to moms. The first thing on day one, as soon as he walks off of that stage, he should immediately stop any and all litigation and all rollbacks that are currently in the pipeline. This administration is trying to steamroll as many things as they can, especially before they get to the time period at which it becomes impossible for them to immediately reverse things in Congress. And so what we're seeing is repetitive action, where they're even doing things such as shortening comment periods. That's what we recently experienced with the NAAQS standards, and just seeing that the fact that they wouldn't even extend their comment periods to the normal allowable time to give people an opportunity to speak up. So they're using the pandemic, they're using the racial injustice that's taking place in the protests across this country as a distraction to really push through the things that this Trump administration wants to do for their friends. We're not standing for it. We are calling them to account, and we are making sure that they're not only accountable, but that we're planning for the next administration to immediately take action to stop it.
Thank you. Our next question is from Ms. Mejia.
Thank you. Thank you again for for your testimony and your very clear roadmap of what we need to do at home in order to protect the environment and protect our community. You know, our nation has abdicated its role at the global level in terms of fighting climate change. One, by walking away from the Paris Agreement, and two, by having the shameful administration make comments about that are ridiculous in terms of the impact of climate change and not believing science. What would you recommend, or what would you like the party and this through the election and into a new administration, what would you like them to prioritize and do in order to reclaim our leadership role at the global level when it comes to protecting our environment in all communities?
Well, thank you. Absolutely, we must realign ourselves with the Paris Accord. But this is one of those moments I'm glad to say that I am a former mayor, because our mayors and governors across this country have been leading in this space, and many of them remained and committed to the Paris Accord and agreement, and ensured that in their own states and cities, they were taking actions to show that. I think the party would do well to listen to the local and state elected officials, follow those things that they have been doing, as they have been right there on the ground with people, and they have been expressing and even working with other mayors globally on how we can shift the tide on climate when our federal government does not do so. The second thing I would think that I think should be done is to listen and look closely at the current, the House Select Committee on Climate Change that's led by Congresswoman Kathy Castor. They have recently come out with a list of recommendations that would really move us forward in terms of establishing things like clean energy and making sure that environmental justice is weaved in every single aspect of our climate solutions. That exists right now today. And I think we should definitely pay attention and see how we can put those things into action as quickly as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's always good to see a fellow mayor, and my father's family is from Greenville and Winterville, Mississippi. So nice to see you.
I love it. Good people.
Thank you. Next, we will hear from Laura Packard, who serves as the co-chair of the Healthcare Voter.
Thank you. My name is Laura Packard, and it's an honor to testify before the platform committee today. Like the Affordable Care Act at age 10, I'm a little shakier at 44, but we're both still here. After President Obama's election, the AFL-CIO sent me to organize in Arkansas. After months of hard work, we thought healthcare reform was passed and our job was done, but it didn't quite turn out like that. In April of 2017, as a healthy 40-year-old, my life forever changed with a diagnosis of stage 4 cancer. The treatment called for 6 months of chemotherapy, culminating with a month of radiation. If I could survive the cure, I had a good chance of outliving the disease. Fortunately, I had purchased a market rate policy on the Affordable Care Act exchange, which is why I was able to afford the care that I needed. Cancer is expensive. It cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to save my life. I would be bankrupt or dead without the Affordable Care Act. But the day after my first chemotherapy session, House Republicans voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act. With my health care and the care of millions of others at stake, I couldn't just concentrate on staying alive. I joined many others and spoke up, dragging myself through treatment and to local events to urge my Senator Heller to do the right thing. He didn't, but thanks to activists around the country, those Republican bills were stopped. I spoke up online too, tweeting at Trump. And one September day, I woke up to find that the President of the United States had blocked me on Twitter. I did finally meet my senator at a public event at the end of 2017, but I was thrown out for daring to ask him about his healthcare record. President Trump eventually unblocked me, and my cancer did go into remission, but Republican attacks on our healthcare continue. They gaslight us, pretending to protect people with pre-existing conditions while quietly stripping the protections we need to survive. When Trump signed his tax reforms into law, the legislation included a provision to remove the individual mandate for health insurance, which set up the groundwork for the court case which now threatens the entire ACA. The fate of up to 135 million people with pre-existing conditions hangs in the balance. Many of us are uninsurable without the law, and many will not survive without insurance. And now COVID-19 is stripping more people each day of their health insurance as they lose their jobs. Uncertainty around healthcare imposes enormous costs. I knew I had to protect myself in case the court ruling came down negatively, so I moved here to Colorado. I'm lucky that I can live like this, but no one should have to. Millions of people can't move to find the best place to live based on a patchwork of limited state-based solutions. Republicans, including my senator, Cory Gardner, voted again and again for repeal without any protections for the most vulnerable. In the time of coronavirus, it's become clear that when a healthcare system does not work for some of us, it fails us all. Thank you.
Thank you. Our first question is from Congresswoman Garcia.
Thank you, Mayor. And first, Laura, let me just thank you for your courage and your stamina and sticking with it, because I know it must be difficult to just have to pick up your entire life and move somewhere else just to get the healthcare access that you need. You know, as my colleagues who are on this committee will remember, we just almost gasped when the president during the State of the Union talked about his support for the Affordable Care Act and protecting pre-existing conditions and blah, 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 blah. At the same time, when he was fighting the court case to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And I've lost track of how many times they filed lawsuits and tried to pass votes to repeal it. So congratulations for sticking with it, and congratulations for being blocked by the President of the United States. You should wear that as a badge of honor. So tell us, what does it feel like? You know, you had to pick up from Arkansas and move to Colorado just to get health care.
Well, nobody should have to live like this. At the end of 2018, during the period where you choose your health insurance for the next year, I had 4 states to pick from to where to live if the court case dismantled the ACA. And that's not sustainable for anybody. Nobody should have to choose where to move to, where to live, just to be able to stay alive. We need healthcare for everyone in red states, in blue states, in every city, in every state.
Thank you, and thank you for your courage, and thank you for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Dr. Gottney.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Ms. Packard, for your testimony. And I second the congratulations on being blocked by Trump. You know you're doing something right when the president doesn't want to interact with you. As you have testified here, the Affordable Care Act has changed the lives of many Americans, especially those with pre-existing conditions. But we know that more needs to be done. What policies would you like to see implemented that would have helped you on your journey through coping with your illness?
Sure. Well, right now there is legislation that the House has passed that's on its way to the Senate that it would help shore up the Affordable Care Act, because if you make a certain amount of money, you fall into a gap where you don't qualify for subsidies, but yet health insurance is still pretty expensive for you. So that is a real problem for millions of Americans. And this piece of legislation will help make it more affordable for everyone across the board, which is why I think it's despicable that so many Republicans won't look at passing common sense pieces of legislation like this that would help millions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Next, we will have a pre-taped video from 6th generation farmer Pam Johnson. Ms. Johnson is the past president of the National Corn Growers Association and MAZAL, the International Association of Corn Growers.
My name is Pam Johnson. I'm a farmer from Iowa, 6th generation. I work with my husband and 2 sons raising corn and soybeans. Farmers like me and the rural communities where we live are really hurting under this presidency. The first thing that President Trump did was to pull us out of a Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement, which was huge for us to sell our products, corn, soybeans, livestock, and be a part of a global marketplace. Also, the steel and aluminum tariffs that he put on to our allies, Canada and Mexico, and threatened to pull us out of NAFTA without renegotiating, made it really hard in the uncertainty, and markets have collapsed. Main streets are having problems. So what do farmers like me need? We need a president, a new change in leadership in the White House who will support trade agreements to allow a farmer to receive our income from the marketplace and not from government payments. We only want to be helped with government payments when we need it, and for risk management like crop insurance is very important to us. Also, we need a president who will support the renewable fuel standard and not favor fossil fuels, and give us markets, jobs, many renewable fuel plants, and also give consumers choices at the pump for cleaner air and better prices, and a fuel that will enable them to have a cleaner burning with less particulates, better for their lungs, better for their health, better for their pocketbook. We also need a president that supports the livestock industry. This presidency has really been hurt and has not managed the COVID crisis, and because of not managing a health crisis, we have an economic crisis, which just compounded all the other bad policy and bad mistakes. In our livestock industry, we've learned how fragile it is, and that we need someone to support the livestock industry, the workers in the packing plants, and to make sure that there's food security and that consumers have a reliable source of food at the supermarket and at farmers markets. So I don't know a farmer around who's making money these days. I hear lots of stories. Bankruptcies are up, and we're at the point where we need a change, and we need it now. So those are some of the issues that are very important to American farmers.
All right, thank you, Ms. Johnson. Next, we will have testimony from Ezra Zaya. Ms. Zaya is a former State Department official working to advocate global peace.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Restoring American leadership on the world stage means breaking down the Berlin Wall between domestic and foreign policy. As my mentor, Bill Burns, has said, the power of our example is infinitely stronger than the power of our preaching. Resolute American leadership is needed to confront and transform the inequalities and injustices at home laid bare by COVID-19. It is a daunting but achievable task if we restore trust in public service, science, and civil society, and give all our citizens a chance to do their part and lead the way. For the soul of America and its greatest strength lies in our diversity and our Constitution's call to form a more perfect union. As an Indian American proud to be the first member of my family born in this country, it was the honor of my lifetime to represent our nation for 27 years as a Foreign Service officer. Wherever I served, from Damascus to New Delhi, I heard a common refrain. The fact that you are an American diplomat is what I love about America. That said, I left a senior Foreign Service in 2018 that was still 88% white and 2/3 male, with underrepresentation of women and Asian Americans, and exclusion of Black Americans, Latinx, and Native Americans compared with their share of the population. The trend line has only worsened since 2017, with representation of Black Americans in the senior foreign service dropping below 3% this year compared to 9% in 2008. To restore American leadership on the world stage, we need a State Department and Foreign Service at all levels that looks like America. We need to end the war on career talent, purge racism from our institutions, and entrust diverse and nonpartisan public servants to support and carry out the president's agenda. We need to rebalance ballooning defense spending toward diplomacy and peace building that saves service member lives and taxpayer dollars by averting forever wars. We also need to change the way we engage the world. NATO allies in Russia should no longer doubt our ironclad commitment to Article 5 and a Europe whole, free, and at peace. Fellow democracies keen to partner on COVID and climate change shouldn't take a back seat to authoritarians who deploy flattery to deflect from destabilizing repression at home. Early US re-entry into the WHO, the Paris Climate Accord, the UN Compact on Migration, and the JCPOA, along with restoration of US refugee admissions above 125,000 annually, will affirm an America ready to lead multilaterally and reform institutions in dire need of a reboot. In today's disrupted world, there is a demand signal for American leadership rooted in our values, our diversity, and the power of our example. It's up to us to answer the call. Thank you.
Thank you. Our first question is from Congresswoman Lee.
Thank you very much. Hello, Ms. Zaya. First of all, thank you very much for your service. And it's really good to hear you and your testimony. A couple of things. Let me just preface it by saying I have a bill, the Department for Peace Building. And so I am so glad to see that you're a CEO of the Alliance for Peace Building. Also, I serve on the State and Foreign Operations Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee. And so we fund our international and diplomatic initiatives. And I have the privilege to visit many countries, including the continent of Africa, talk to our Foreign Service personnel, our Peace Corps personnel, everyone throughout the world. And I see very few people of color, African Americans specifically, on the continent of Africa. And our best ambassadors are and our best face on the globe presents in the diversity of our great nation. And so what is it that we can do to create a foreign service that looks like America throughout the world? I remember when Ron Brown was Secretary of Commerce, that was a big push to make sure that our trade relations and our business relations incorporated diverse businesses, and we have gone all the way backwards. So how do you think this platform can present suggestions on the best way to diversify our diplomatic initiatives? Because peace building and preventing conflicts is so important. And we should see this also as a national security issue. And so what would you propose, and how do you think we need to view this moving forward?
Congresswoman, let me thank you for your support for peace building, for your support for diplomacy and development all these years. You are a leader in our nation. I believe we need to recognize, as you said, diversity as a national security priority for the United States. It is a proven fact. There's a vast body of research that shows that organizations that are more diverse are more innovative and are more impactful. And we also have a legislative mandate from the Foreign Service Act of 1980, which calls for a foreign service that represents all of America. And 40 years later, I'm sad to say, we are seeing a situation deteriorating. We're seeing a time machine operating in reverse, where, as I pointed out, the presence of African Americans in the senior foreign service, this is where ambassadors, where all of the top level officials who execute our diplomacy are drawn. That number has dropped from 9%, which was already too low, to below 3% in 2020. So what do we need? We need from day one a commitment. We need a national security leadership that represents America's diversity, the breadth of our expertise, and a commitment to really lead and drive transformative change throughout the world. There are wonderful programs like the Pickering and Wrangle programs that have really helped create channels for entry for underrepresented groups, but they have fallen short. We need to double down on those investments. We need to open the pipeline at all levels. You can't ask your most talented recruits to wait 25 to 30 years to reach a position of responsibility.
Thank you very much. And let me just close by saying how much I appreciate you laying this out, because so often now, especially since the world is focused on the United States and the impact and the manifestation of systemic racism, we have to define it each and every time we talk and see where we see such exclusion. Here we are once again looking at a foreign service where inherent in it, you have policies that have created now such a disparity and such a gap. And it's a shame and disgrace. And we have to make sure that our platform reflects exactly what you said. So thank you again. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Next, we have a question from Ms. Smith.
Thank you, Mayor Bottoms, and thank you so much, Ms. Zaya, for your testimony today and for your public service. It seems like over the last decade or so, as Washington continues to be frowned upon, I think people have bad attitudes about public service, about our government, about Congress, about Washington as a city. All of that, I think, reflects on young people's desire to join the Foreign Service. And if I'm not mistaken, I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is actually a decline in young people coming out of college interested in following in your footsteps. So do you have some ideas and suggestions on how we could generate more interest in public service, particularly the Foreign Service, and bring those applications up and ensure that we're attracting the absolute best in the next generation?
I think that's a great question. And when you look at the enormity of national security challenges before us, we need to open that pipeline now. I think it comes with going beyond, I would say, some of the traditional universities and looking more towards historically Black colleges and universities, looking at the successful model of the Pickering and Wrangle programs, but really looking to expand it. I think there have been some excellent ideas put forward about investing in an equivalent to the Reserve Officer Training Corps, ROTC, for the State Department, where you are mentoring, you are bringing in young and ambitious leaders to learn about this work and make a public service commitment. I'm a mother of two, and I have to say that this generation is purpose-driven, and I believe that those young people are out there, but I think they have to see from the top a recognition and a respect of public service, of science, of expertise, and of our nation and in all its diversity. And I do believe those young people will come forward.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
My apologies, Ms. Smith. Joining us next is Mark Magana. Mr. Magana served as a special assistant for legislative affairs under President Bill Clinton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good evening. My name is Mark Magana, and I'm a new resident of Boulder, Colorado, with my partner and 2 children after spending 30 years in Washington, D.C. I'm speaking in my individual capacity, and the views I express are solely my own. I grew up in Los Angeles in the 1970s when the smog was so bad that as a child we used to have to wake up and watch the weather report to see if we were allowed to play that day outside. And the days we were allowed to play, we'd have to take breaks so that the kids with asthma could take their inhalers. That became the normal, inhaler breaks. This is not a way for a child to live, and this is not a way for our community to be living. Now I have 2 children of my own, and I'm responsible for their health and their uptake. And I am fortunate to be able to get them clean air, to buy air purifiers, to buy water purifiers, to buy organic food. But it shouldn't have to be this way. Race and poverty are the strongest predictors of disproportionate levels of environmental hazards in the air, water, food, and land in our communities. Millions of Latinos living near oil and gas facilities, freeways, manufacturing, utilities, and ports are suffering from exposure to toxics and unhealthy air quality every day. We must strengthen and support aggressive enforcement of current environmental and civil rights laws and report on the cumulative impacts that the proposed action or permit may have on our communities. We must support programs that allow communities to implement projects to address their own environmental disparities, and we must ensure that the most vulnerable can equitably access the benefits of our environmental and conservation policies. Latino farm workers, for one, they are ensuring our food security during the COVID-19 crisis, yet they are excluded from many of the basic workplace protections from extreme heat, respiratory threats, and chemical pesticide exposure. It is time to stand up against the racism and provide basic workplace protections for our farm worker heroes. Right now, we are facing an existential climate crisis that could soon lock in a degraded future for our planet, our families, and for generations to come. Changes in climate are hitting our communities hardest, and with the majority of Latinos living in areas that are already experiencing devastating climate-related extreme weather events. We must rejoin the Paris Agreement and urgently implement equitable and comprehensive climate legislation to address the negative effects of climate change, invest in climate resilience, and rapidly reduce carbon emissions, and increase renewable energy, especially on public lands, to combat the climate crisis. We must ensure that climate solutions originate from frontline communities, address inequities, and provide justice and prosperity for all. Climate-forced migration is increasing by the millions, with women suffering and dying disproportionately. We must include migrant and gender-sensitive strategies in the policymaking response to the global effects of climate change. Today, the border wall represents the most significant threat to Latino communities along the southern border, disrupting their daily lives and forever damaging their environment. Trump's border wall of racism and intolerance must be torn down, or we are complicit in its standing. Latino communities understand that it is critically important to protect our public lands. We support the permanent authorization and full funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund and funding to address the public lands maintenance backlog. We oppose the repeal of the Antiquities Act and support efforts to restore national land monuments like Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante national monuments, and oppose oil and gas drilling in the Arctic. Our public lands are often inaccessible and unwelcoming to people of color, and we must ensure that we all have access to the recreational and economic opportunities that exist there. We support increasing access to public lands, outdoor experiences, and education for underrepresented communities. We support opportunities for Latino small businesses to participate in the outdoor recreation economy and support efforts to identify, designate, and protect more places, especially in park-poor urban areas, that preserve and tell stories of the historical contributions and cultural connections to the land of Latinos, Latinas, and LGBT Latinx individuals. Our oceans and coasts are vital biodiverse ecosystems and our greatest shared resource. We oppose efforts to roll back existing marine monuments and support efforts to protect 30% of the oceans and lands by 2030. We urge the enactment of an offshore drilling ban in the Gulf of Mexico, Atlantic, and Pacific coasts, and support curbing plastic production and incentivizing responsible plastic recycling. We support a just transition to 100% clean energy that provides workers in the fossil fuel industry an opportunity to access training and jobs in the burgeoning clean energy economy. And we support the extension and refundability of the renewable energy tax credit. Finally, many Latino communities are drinking poisonous water every day, contaminated with lead, coal ash, microplastics, fracking wastewater, PFAS, and other chemicals. To many communities have unaffordable and unregulated water service and inadequate wastewater treatment infrastructure. We must strengthen laws and regulations protecting water, improving enforcement, and greatly increasing federal investment in sustainable water infrastructure in vulnerable communities. We also must halt the inhumane practice of household water shutoffs, for water is life. We are in a do or die moment with the climate crisis, and I know that we can and will take the bold steps necessary to face this challenge and save civilization. Thank you for your time and your attention.
Thank you. Our first question is from Mr. Orton.
Hey, thanks, Mark, for your testimony today. I think we all agree that over the past decades, fossil fuel companies have resisted even incremental climate legislation and have recklessly continued to create these conditions that sicken and kill communities of color, despite knowing, 20, 30, 40 years ago that their products have deadly effects. And as you said, scientists say that the time before irreversible climate damage is quickly running out. A significant number of these climate scientists also say we need to go beyond the enforcement of existing regulations and implement a massive federal investment through a Green New Deal that includes full environmental justice provisions, and that we need to declare a climate emergency to finally stand up to the existential power of the corruption of fossil fuel corporations. Do you agree? And can you talk a little bit more about the specific role you see the government is having to finally stand up to these fossil fuel corporations?
Josh, you've stated it so well already. A couple things that we have right now is that money is corrupting our politics, and that the money that you stated clearly that's coming from these oil and gas lobbyists is something that is not allowing people to take the general have the smart sense to protect our planet and the human beings that live in it. Programs like the Green New Deal that have a comprehensive strike on what we need to change in our economy, what we need to change in equity, what we need to change in justice are a smart way to go. And we need to move forward. It's going to take a groundswell of people and individuals to fight for this change, because it is a large scale change of our economic work, of our governmental work. And it's not something that's going to happen overnight, but it is something that people are realizing and communities are realizing that they're going to have to step up and step into this fight so that we can do this. And our government needs to call a climate emergency like many cities, counties, and states are doing right now. We've seen an emergency with COVID-19. We understand what happens when you don't take action and when you don't take it federally. And we see the destructive nature of standing by and watching while we die. And this is something that the national government, state and local governments, and us as individuals all have a responsibility to step in and take action now.
Well, I thank you for your work and for your voice.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you. Our next question is from Secretary Vilsack.
Thanks, Mayor. Mark, thank you very much for your passionate discussion of so many environmental issues that need attention. I want you to assume, for the sake of my question, that you've been asked to put together a memo for the recently elected President-elect Biden, outlining what should occur on day one of that administration as it relates to the environmental policies, particularly in light of the rollbacks that have taken place during the previous administration. What's on that memo?
Well, clearly we need to start from the top, which is getting back in the Paris Agreement, which is doing things like reenacting the Clean Power Plan with even stronger and more stringent timelines. And we need to take back the regulations that this administration has corrupted. Clean air, clean water, clean cars. All these things are destructive to our communities. And most importantly, we need to bring together the frontline communities. If you were going to ask someone how to go into space, you would ask someone who's been to space, or someone from NASA at least. And if you're going to ask someone, how do we clean up the climate and how do we clean up the most polluted communities, you need to talk to the frontline communities. So it's a matter of bringing them to the table at day one and talking to them. It's not just talking to the mainstream groups. It's talking to the EJ, the communities of color, the low-income communities who are dying of cancer, of asthma, and they need to be reflected in the equitable and fair policies that we enact. All these things need to happen in day one, and we need to pass a serious national piece of legislation by day 100. Thank you, Secretary Vilsack.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. And our final question is from Senator Rodriguez.
Mr. Mangana, thank you so much for your work and your testimony. I'm a state senator in Florida. I represent a diverse district in ground zero for many of the impacts of climate. And I really appreciate your statements, and your testimony is a really comprehensive way of approaching climate that really needs to be at the center of how we look at the climate crisis. And it is, frankly, at the center as Democrats is how we look at it. There's a couple problems we face, and kind of to frame my question for you. One is, here in Florida, the bar is unbelievably low. We had Rick Scott, who is hostile to the agenda of climate. And now the bar is so low that lip service, just saying climate, is sort of like, Republican politicians get lavished with praise, which makes it really hard to accomplish anything substantive. But a bigger issue that I've seen is that when policymakers are stuck on the impact of climate, not the effects, and when they're stuck on frankly, protecting property more than protecting people, it really hinders what we can accomplish. And so what I mean by that is, again, I serve a diverse district in Miami. And so when the conversation is about water coming over a seawall, everybody's imagination is about affluent residents on the water, right? Whereas the real impact of climate for most of my constituents is and will be water quality, air quality, heat stress for construction workers. And so the little point of personal privilege, this year we finally passed the first piece of transformative legislation on climate. I worked on it for 3 years. It was a lot of work, and coalition building was part of that. And we're still struggling to get past climate being an environmental or economic topic and making it, number one, a public health issue, and an issue of social justice and housing. So if you could share with us insights about how we move forward our climate platform, how we get it into effect, by talking a little bit about that coalition building, how we bring people to the table on the economic justice aspects of climate.
Well, one example, when we work with the Latino community, we work a lot with the mothers. We work a lot with, and we've worked with Moms Clean Air Force, and I heard Heather Toney speak earlier so eloquently about it. We work with the forces, and when our community expresses its concern on climate change, on environmental, they express it as far as the effects that it has on their children. Latino children are twice as likely to die from asthma. And when you put that link from asthma onto that smokestack that is in their neighborhood and not in the richer neighborhood, in that manufacturing and that utility and that freeway and that port that's in their neighborhood and that flooding that's in their neighborhood and not in the wealthy neighborhood, then they start to look at it in terms of equity. They start looking at it in terms of what's going to happen to my children and their children. And that really motivates people. And when you start talking about that, they're also motivated that they're willing to spend, if needed, a little bit more on clean energy. But more and more, we're not having to as solar comes down and as wind comes down. But it is important that we also convey these same messages to other constituencies in ways that resonate to them, whether it's constituencies that support our national security and want us to have energy security, whether it's constituencies, conservative constituencies like religious constituencies that want to make sure that we support our earth and God's creation, or whether it's conservative constituencies like hunters and anglers that want to make sure that we have healthy wildlife and healthy streams and waters. All of these ways that we need to convey, and for others it might be economic reasons, for others it might be healthy food. We need to be able to convey the messaging that fits. And for Florida, yes, the bar is low. Just being able to say climate change makes them a hero. And that shouldn't be true anymore. Because In Florida, when you have date sunlight flooding, and you have communities that are having pollution, wastewater in their communities, then this is something that we need to make sure that we address. And we can do this with multiple communities that can come together with the right messaging for each of them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rodriguez.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Next, we will have a pre-tape video from Michelle Dietrich, who serves as chair of the DNC's Council on Environment and Climate Crisis.
I'm Michelle Dietrich, DNC member and chair of the DNC Environment and Climate Crisis Council. Let's be clear, the climate crisis is here. It is not years down the road, and we must act. The current administration's policies are disastrous. As Democrats, we have the responsibility to lead on this issue. That's why our DNC Council was established. That's why we launched a national listening tour, talking with a diverse set of people across the U.S. to understand how climate and environmental harms are impacting people and communities. That's why we are proposing a bold, science-based, and comprehensive set of climate and environmental policies for the Democratic Party's 2020 platform, a set of recommendations supported by a broad coalition, more than 70 organizations representing millions of people, including Sunrise, 350 Action, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, the Center for Biological Diversity Action Fund, and many, many organizations in Democratic and Young Democratic caucuses. Our nation and world face integrally related crises: the climate emergency, the COVID-19 pandemic, an epic economic downturn with tens of millions unemployed. All this compounds and exposes decades of increasing, devastating levels of racial injustice and systemic inequality, the deterioration of our social safety net, and environmental and infrastructure degradation. We are going to need to rebuild our economy, and we can either invest in propping up the old economy that is devastating our planet and our future, or we can choose to do so sustainably, creating millions of high-quality union jobs and centering justice while transitioning away from a fossil fuel economy to a regenerative one powered by clean, renewable energy. Our comprehensive policy recommendations include a full suite of actions to protect our environment, fight the climate crisis, and rebuild our economy, including declare a climate emergency, develop a national climate action plan and launch it, engage in a managed transition to 100% clean, renewable energy with zero emissions and the fossil fuel era, beginning with zero carbon new building infrastructure by 2025, 100% clean, renewable energy by 2030 for power generation, and near zero emissions by 2040. It's eminently doable and necessary. Most recent data and science indicate the climate crisis is getting worse much faster than the UN report of just 2 years ago indicated, and it's gravely concerning that many current plans are based on that outdated science. We should invest massively in wind, solar, geothermal, and green infrastructure, with income pension and a just transition for workers who are displaced, and also for those seriously impacted by the climate crisis and their communities. We should guarantee the right to clean air, water, and drinking water as fundamental human rights, ban water shutoffs, protect 30% of our land by 2030. Systemic racism and inequality mean predominantly Black, Brown, Indigenous, and less resourced communities bear a vastly disproportionate harm from polluting industries. We should direct 40% of climate and environmental investments to those communities. Our full recommendations are on our website, dncclimate.org. I'm glad to send them to any platform community member. We urge you to embrace these policies, which should be the most comprehensive and bold ever adopted by the Democratic Party. The moment demands it. We can afford nothing less.
All right, thank you. And our final speaker will come from a pre-tape video from Professor Ernest Moniz. Professor Moniz is the former Secretary of Energy in the Obama administration and is the founder of the Energy Futures Initiative.
In considering the platform on clean energy and climate change, I urge incorporation of 6 key themes in reinforcing a commitment to net zero emissions economy-wide by mid-century and net negative emissions thereafter. 1, coalitions. We cannot effect accelerated sustainable change of our massive energy system without doing the hard work of building broad coalitions, labor and business, NGOs and financial institutions, religious and military leaders, public and private sectors, federal, state, and city leaders, Democrats and Republicans. And this will require pragmatism. 2nd, regional solutions with social justice. celebrate that energy resources and challenges and social equity needs vary considerably by region, and empower regionally tailored solutions. 3, all of the above. Acknowledge that there are no silver bullet solutions for net zero emissions and beyond, and that every no to low carbon pathway enables others. We need energy efficiency across all economic sectors, advanced renewables such as offshore wind, electricity storage at timescales from minutes to seasons, advanced small modular and micro nuclear technologies, both fission and fusion, carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration at large scale, hydrogen, associated infrastructures such as smart grids, EV fast charging, CO2 pipes, hydrogen transport, build up of secure supply chains, including for critical minerals and metals, carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere and upper oceans using natural, technological, and hybrid solutions at scale, without which there cannot be a net negative future. All of the above will address electricity emissions and those from harder to decarbonize sectors like industry, transportation, and agriculture, and will enable regional solutions. 4, jobs, jobs, jobs. We need to create millions of good jobs coming out of COVID and into the future. Over the last 5 pre-COVID years, energy sector job creation outpaced the economy more than 2 to 1. So congressional stimulus, appropriations, or other authorities for clean energy will leverage strong job creation. 5, domestic supply chains. Strategically incentivized supply chains mean jobs and security, an important COVID lesson. Public-private partnerships are important, and policy support is also important, such as carbon border adjustments supporting clean manufacturing. And 6, innovation. To meet our goals, we'll need breakthroughs. We need a decade, starting now, of supercharged innovation from research to demonstration, supplemented by deployment incentives in order to be able to scale clean energy dramatically after 2030. Doubling or tripling public clean energy innovation investment, amounting to about an additional $100 billion over the decade, will catalyze the synergistic development of technologies, business models, and jobs needed to reach our aggressive climate and social justice goals. My colleagues and I stand ready to elaborate on any and all of these bedrock themes. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And before we end, I would like to note that we were going to be joined by Yolanda Russell, who is the Florida Democratic Party's Senior Caucus President. Ms. Russell was going to speak about the importance of protecting Social Security for the millions of Americans who depend on the program. While this administration is focused on destroying this vital program, Joe Biden is committed to protecting Social Security for the millions of Americans who depend on the program. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of our hearing for today. Thank you to all of the witnesses who joined us over the course of these past 3 hearings. Your perspectives were invaluable, and they challenge us to make sure that the platform we draft will reflect who we are as a people. We truly appreciate your perspectives and recommendations on how to best address the issues confronting our country. Repairing the damage that Donald Trump has done to this country will be the work of generations, but it begins with electing Joe Biden this fall and implementing what will be, without a doubt, the most progressive platform in our party's history. I am reminded of the words of Frederick Douglass: if there is no struggle, there is no progress. We know that progress is rarely easy, but together I believe that we can move our country forward and resign Donald Trump to the dustbin of history and elect Joe Biden as president. Drafting committee members, our next step will be to review the draft platform at our meeting on July 15th, which will be live streamed on the Democratic National Convention's YouTube channel. In the meantime, please don't forget to go online to stories.demconvention.com to share your thoughts and ideas. I know that we are all committed to working together on a platform that reflects our shared and collective values and is a tool to elect Joe Biden president. It has been an honor to join all of you all over the last 3 nights this week, and I look forward to seeing you again on July 15th, and happy Independence Day to all of you. Thank you. And we finished 1 minute early. Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Madam Chair, we have one more witness. Dr. Allen, do you want to introduce Dr. Rose?
Yeah, Madam Chair, we had one more witness on the. It's Dean Quincy Rose. She's a proud Delaware State alum and is the Dean of the College of Education at Harris Stowe and is an expert on the Violence Against Women Act. I want to give her an opportunity to testify if that was your pleasure.
Yes, my apologies, Dr. Rose. I saw you there, but I thought that you were just observing what we were doing this evening. My apologies. Please go ahead.
No worries. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you as well, President Allen, for the introduction. I am a family member of a victim of domestic violence. Unfortunately, my sister Whitney was a victim of domestic violence homicide. And it's because of her homicide, and it's because of the many families throughout the country who have experienced domestic violence within their households, that I remain a staunch advocate for domestic violence awareness and prevention. I like to think that I'm only one of a handful of families that have been affected. But with COVID-19 happening in particular, we know that victims of domestic violence often start off, or victimization often starts off with isolation. And we know that with COVID-19 happening and many people being quarantined, that we're seeing those numbers go up in domestic violence. We're seeing the numbers rise in domestic violence. We're seeing the numbers rise in child abuse. We're seeing the numbers rise across the board as it relates to abuse. And so one of the things that really needs to be at the forefront of our upcoming administration, which I know Joe Biden will do an excellent job of, one of the things that needs to be at the forefront is the reaffirmation of VAWA, right? We know that the Violence Against Women Act not only protects women, but protects communities. One of the other things that also needs to be at the forefront of the administration, the upcoming administration, is the sexual assault on college and university campuses. We're seeing across the board those numbers escalate, where we're seeing more and more victims who are victims of abuse, whether it's domestic violence, sexual assault on college and university campuses, and certainly child abuse. And so one of the things that I'm very disappointed in our current administration, the current president has done little to nothing to address those issues, and certainly has not supported it with any financial resources. I am certainly encouraged and know for a fact that when Joe Biden is president of the United States, he will absolutely make it a priority. He will make the safety of our communities, the safety of our college campuses, the safety of our men and women a top priority. This is not something that can wait to be on a 100-day agenda. This must be on the agenda from day one, so that there are fewer victims of domestic violence, fewer households that are having to suffer at the hands of an abusive person. So one of the things that I encourage us to make a top priority is the domestic violence awareness and prevention, the focus on sexual assault awareness and prevention on college and university campuses, and certainly child abuse. And I absolutely thank you for this opportunity to share my story.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rose. We do have 2 questions for you. The first from Congresswoman Garcia.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Ms. Rose. And I hear you're not only an advocate on this issue, but a fierce advocate. And you're my kind of gal, and you're a fierce advocate on this issue, because I certainly have been an advocate on this issue also. And I can tell you that all the women of Congress that are on this committee have also. And I know that you have been at the forefront on this issue. And we know that Joe Biden has been a big advocate on this issue also, and it's serving on Judiciary Committee. I know that we passed a reauthorization some time ago, but it, again, is one of those pieces of legislation that just sits and collects dust on Mitch McConnell's desk. So if you were in my shoes, or in Barbara Lee's shoes, or Catherine Clark's shoes, or Deb Haaland's shoes, what would you say to the Republicans? What message would you just scream and yell at them? I mean, what is our message to Republicans on why they really need to move on that bill?
One of the reasons why they really need to move up that bill is because we're gone are the days where we're 1 in 5 for victims. Now we're 1 out of 3 families, and 1 out of 3 women in particular who are victims of domestic violence homicide. Those numbers are closing in on us as 2020 progresses. We cannot afford to sit on that bill. We're absolutely suffering. Many families are suffering as a result of us sitting still on that bill. And as a result of that, not only is it affecting women and men, but it's affecting every aspect of our communities. Everything from the impact on our communities to our economy as a whole. And so to really do nothing about the reauthorization of VAWA and to really not move the issue of domestic violence awareness and prevention forward absolutely says that we have no value for life. And if we value life the way that we say that we as Americans say that we value life, then this needs to be at the forefront.
So what would you tell Mitch McConnell today, right now, if I was him and you were talking to him right now?
That 5 seconds ago, a woman was killed. And if we wait another 5 seconds, another woman will be killed. And if we wait another 5 seconds, it could be a man or a woman killed, all because it sits on his desk.
Thank you. I think those words are powerful, and thank you for your advocacy. And Mayor, I yield back and thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Ms. Mejia.
Thank you. Thank you for the work that you do. I'd like to ask, sadly, violence against women is pervasive in our nation, in our society, in many ways rooted in discrimination and inequality. And sadly, in many ways, very invisible, whether it is domestic violence or violence against women committed through police brutality. Many of us just simply don't see it. What would you want this party to do and to prioritize through not only this electoral cycle, but in a future administration to make people see, to make this problem less invisible, particularly violence against women of color, trans women, women from tribal nations?
Thank you so much for that question. One of the things that I've noticed over the many years of my work as an advocate is that oftentimes, particularly I'm noticing it now, oftentimes women and community members and communities as a whole will not speak out because they're not certain that their voices are going to be heard. And so when you provide the resources, when you provide the platform, that if you are a victim of domestic violence, if you know of someone who's a victim of domestic violence, that we will provide the resources and we'll absolutely hear your needs, and that we will absolutely address the concern. When we know that our voices are being heard, then we're more apt to do something. Unfortunately, where I'm at right now, I happen to be out getting dinner with my family the other day, and I happen to be in an inner city environment, and not that it really matters, but one of the things I saw a man kick a woman. He kicked her in broad daylight, kicked her from behind. She was crying and screaming. And maybe because I am the advocate that I am and I was with a group of people, oftentimes what I saw in the environment, or many people were walking by as this man kicked the woman down the street. We stopped. He saw us stop. And again, we had to make sure that it was a safe zone, and we provided a safe environment for her to give her transportation to get to a safe area. If we don't feel that our voices are being heard, then we're less likely to speak up about it. We're less likely to do something about it. Clearly, our current administration has done little to address the issues as it relates to domestic violence. We need a president, and that is what Joe Biden will be. He is a person who will hear us, will provide the resources for us to speak up and speak out to help us as victims of domestic violence.
May I ask, I know we're short on time, just a quick follow-up. What would you recommend be prioritized as we consider police reforms in order to tackle violence against women?
It absolutely needs to be a part of the education of the police department, right? It absolutely needs to be embedded where our police departments are training our police officers to effectively not only just show up at a situation where there's abuse, but also to understand the need and the cry for help and victimization. So it absolutely needs to be embedded in the education of our police department. in the training of our police officers, not just the one and done, but on a continuous basis. But that needs to be done on a regular basis as it relates to equity as a whole, and certainly protection of those who are victims of domestic violence as well. That training, that awareness needs to happen on a regular basis.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rose, for sharing your testimony with us. I know across this country, domestic violence rates are up, and unfortunately, we aren't getting the numbers in on child abuse cases because our kids aren't in school, where quite often that abuse is seen. So I appreciate your advocacy, and thank you for patiently waiting to share your testimony with us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share.
Thank you. Does that conclude our business for this evening? Should I give my speech closing again? All right. Thank you all. Nice to see you all. See you again on the 15th. Thank you.
Thank you.